across the Ocean of Parc. Prologue, the Whispering Ocean. Long before Sproutlyn ever placed a tiny root into soil upon the deck of Egabrag, the Ocean of Parc had already begun its quiet work. Parc was not an ordinary ocean. From afar it appeared like any other body of water, blue-grey, wide, shimmering beneath the slow wandering of clouds. But those who lived long enough near its shores began to notice something peculiar. The ocean seemed to listen. It listened to the wind brushing across its surface. It listened to the moon tugging gently at its tides. It listened even to the thoughts of those who stood quietly along its docks. And sometimes, only sometimes, it seemed to answer. Not in words, of course, but in patterns. A shift of current, a ripple where there had been none, a sudden glimmer of reflected starlight dancing across the waves like scattered silver seeds. The old sailors of Parc often said, "The ocean teaches anyone patient enough to watch it." Most people, however, were not patient. They hurried along the wooden planks of the harbour with baskets, crates, tools, and errands that felt terribly important at the time. They looked at the ocean only briefly, as though glancing at an old friend they meant to visit, but never quite did. Yet there were certain places along the coast where the rhythm of life slowed enough for listening to occur. One such place was the Dock of Listening. It was not the largest harbour on Parc, nor the busiest. But those who came there did so with a peculiar intention, to pause. Lanterns hung from weathered beams. The smell of roasted herbs and spiced tea drifted lazily across the dock planks. Musicians sometimes sat with battered instruments, letting their melodies float over the tide like drifting petals. At the heart of the dock stood a place known far beyond the harbour itself, the Black Orchid Cafe. No one quite agreed on how long the cafe had been there. Some said generations. Others insisted it had appeared mysteriously one foggy morning, already full of tables, lanterns, and the comforting warmth of conversation. The cafe was not large, yet it contained an unusual quality. The moment one stepped inside, time seemed to stretch slightly, like a hammock swaying between two trees. Travellers gathered there, sailors fresh from storms, gardeners carrying curious seeds, philosophers with notebooks full of unfinished thoughts, artists with ink-stained fingers. They came for tea, conversation, and the strange sense that ideas exchanged within those walls had a habit of echoing outward into life. Just beyond the cafe, carved into a natural slope of stone overlooking the sea, stood another remarkable place. The amphitheatre of echoing wisdom. It was a wide stone bowl shaped by both nature and careful hands. Smooth steps curved downward toward a circular stage where storytellers, thinkers, wanderers, and sometimes the occasional wildly enthusiastic philosopher gathered to share experiences. Words spoken there had a curious way of travelling. A story told at dusk might inspire a voyage the following morning. A question asked beneath the lantern light might ripple through someone's mind for years before revealing its answer. Between the cafe, the amphitheatre, and the ocean, a quiet triangle of learning had formed. Conversation, reflection, experience. Many who passed through this harbour left changed in subtle ways, but on a certain morning something slightly more unusual was about to occur, because tied quietly to the dock near the cafe stood a ship unlike any other that had ever sailed the waters of Parc. Its name was Egabrag. Egabrag looked like an ordinary wooden vessel from a distance, broad hull, tall mast, sails neatly tied. But anyone who stepped closer would quickly notice a curious feature. Across the central deck of the ship grew a garden, real soil, real plants, rows of moss beds and herbs gently swaying in the ocean breeze. Some travellers found this charming, others found it puzzling. A few thought it completely impractical. But one ancient figure standing aboard the vessel knew something most others did not. Leaning against the mast with a glowing staff in hand stood Mangolius Draconium, the wise sprout whisperer. His bark-textured robes moved softly with the wind, as though they themselves had once grown from living wood. Mangolius watched the harbour with patient eyes, not the hurried merchants, not the passing sailors, but the subtle movements that most overlooked, a crow landing on a lantern post, the slow rhythm of tide against the dock, the quiet footsteps of a small figure approaching from the far end of the harbour, a mandrake sprout, small, curious, leafy hair gently ruffled by the breeze. This sprout had a habit of asking questions that did not always have obvious answers. Her name was Sproutlyn. She did not yet know that this morning would change everything. She did not yet know that the garden upon Egabrag's deck was not merely a decoration, nor that the cafe behind her and the amphitheatre beyond it would soon become part of a journey far larger than she could imagine. She only knew that something about the ship felt inviting. As Sproutlyn walked slowly along the dock, she paused beside the railing and looked out over the endless waters of Parc. The ocean shimmered in the early sunlight like a vast breathing mirror. For a moment she wondered something quietly to herself. How does one know where to go in a world this large? Behind her, the warm scent of tea drifted from the Black Orchid Cafe. Ahead of her waited the mysterious ship Egabrag, and somewhere far out on the horizon, unseen currents had already begun arranging the path of a voyage that would teach her something remarkable. That navigating a life is not only about steering a ship, it is also about tending a garden while crossing an ocean. And so, on that quiet morning at the dock of listening, the journey began, not with a command shouted across the deck, nor with sails snapping open to the wind, but with a single curious step. Sproutlyn placed one tiny foot upon the wooden ramp leading toward the garden ship Egabrag, and the Ocean of Parc, listening as always, gently shifted its tide. Chapter 1. The ship called Egabrag, where Sproutlyn steps aboard, meets Mangolius, and first learns that gardening and navigation may be the same art. The ship called Egabrag. Morning arrived at the dock of listening the way it often did on the shores of the Ocean of Parc, not with noise or urgency, but with a slow unfolding, like the opening of a flower that has learned patience from the sun. The tide crept along the wooden pylons with a quiet lap, 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 as though the ocean were gently turning pages in a book only it could read. Lanterns hanging outside the Black Orchid Cafe were just being extinguished one by the early staff. The night's last patrons, deep thinkers, insomniac poets, and sailors who claimed sleep was a suggestion rather than a necessity, were finishing the final sips of their tea. Inside the cafe, the warm scent of roasted chicory root and dark herbal brew still lingered in the air. Outside, however, a different story was beginning, because just beyond the cafe's terrace, tied calmly to the dock as though it had always belonged there, floated the ship called Egabrag. To most passing travellers, Egabrag looked like a vessel with an identity crisis. It had the broad hull of a cargo ship, the tall mast of a sailing vessel, and the deck arrangement of something that appeared suspiciously like a garden. Sproutlyn approached slowly. Her tiny root feet made soft tapping sounds along the dock planks as she walked. She had seen ships before. Many of them. The harbour welcomed dozens every season, but none had soil boxes growing vegetables, none had trellises climbing the railings, none had moss beds glowing softly in the morning light. Sproutlyn stopped at the end of the dock and leaned forward slightly. She sniffed. That was definitely basil and thyme, and something else she couldn't quite identify, something ancient and earthy that smelled faintly like rain falling on forest roots. Her leafy hair rustled gently in the breeze. "Why," she murmured thoughtfully, "would someone grow a garden on a ship?" Behind her a voice answered, "Because the ocean is not navigated by ropes alone." Sproutlyn jumped slightly and turned. Standing on the deck of Egabrag, leaning calmly against the mast, was a figure whose presence felt both grounded and ancient. Mangolius Draconium. His beard flowed like pale river moss. His robe looked less like fabric and more like bark that had decided to become clothing. In one hand he held a staff topped with a softly glowing orb that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat made of light. Mangolius had the patient expression of someone who had been watching the ocean for a very long time. He studied Sproutlyn kindly. "Good morning," he said. Sproutlyn blinked. "Good morning," she replied. There was a brief pause. Sproutlyn pointed cautiously at the garden on the deck. "Is that intentional?" Mangolius chuckled. "Yes." Sproutlyn thought about this for a moment. "Does it not fall over during storms?" Mangolius nodded. "Oh, it does." Sproutlyn tilted her head. "And you keep it anyway?" Mangolius smiled. "Of course." He gestured toward the gangplank leading up to the ship. "Well then," he said gently, "come aboard." Sproutlyn hesitated. The ramp creaked softly in the wind, swaying just slightly over the water. Behind her, the harbour hummed with familiar life, the comforting clatter of cups from the Black Orchid Café, the murmur of morning conversations, the slow rhythm of fishermen preparing their nets. Everything she knew was there. Ahead of her waited a ship with a garden and a mysterious sprout, whispering captain who spoke in riddles. Naturally, Sproutlyn stepped forward. The moment her root feet touched the wooden ramp, a strange feeling passed through her, like the quiet awareness one gets when crossing the threshold of a place that holds stories. The ramp creaked. The ocean below reflected soft morning light, and then Sproutlyn stepped onto the deck of Egabrag. The first thing she noticed was the soil. Real soil, dark and rich, packed carefully into sturdy wooden boxes arranged across the central deck. Small stone paths wound between them. Herbs grew in tidy clusters. A climbing vine had already begun wrapping itself lovingly around the mast. Tiny lanterns hung above the beds, clearly meant for night tending. Sproutlyn crouched beside one of the boxes and gently pressed a finger into the soil. It was perfect, balanced, alive. She looked up at Mangolius with amazement. "This is beautiful." Mangolius nodded. "Yes, but it's also confusing." Sproutlyn looked around. "Why would someone grow plants on a ship?" Mangolius walked slowly toward the railing and looked out over the Ocean of Parc. The water stretched endlessly outward, shimmering like a giant sheet of breathing glass. "Tell me something, Sproutlyn," he said quietly. "When you plant a seed, how does it know where to grow?" Sproutlyn answered immediately. "The roots go down, and the leaves, they reach for the sun." Mangolius nodded. "And do you teach the plant how to do that?" Sproutlyn frowned slightly. "Well, no." "So how does it know?" Sproutlyn opened her mouth to answer, then paused, then blinked. "I don't know." Mangolius tapped his staff lightly on the deck. "That," he said gently, "is the beginning of navigation." Sproutlyn looked puzzled. Mangolius walked to a small wooden table near the helm. Upon the table sat a polished brass instrument, a compass. The needle quivered slightly as the ship rocked gently with the tide. Mangolius pointed toward it. "This instrument seeks north." Then he pointed toward the garden beds. "These seek water." He looked at Sproutlyn. "And both are doing the same thing." Sproutlyn stared at the compass, then the plants, then the compass again. Something about the comparison made her mind feel like a door had just cracked open slightly. "But this is a ship," she said slowly. Mangolius smiled. "Yes, and a garden. But ships travel and gardens grow." Mangolius nodded approvingly. "Exactly." Sproutlyn crossed her arms and thought very seriously. "So which is it?" Mangolius leaned casually against the railing. "Both." Sproutlyn squinted at him. "That is not a proper answer." Mangolius chuckled softly. "No, but it is a truthful one." The wind shifted slightly. The sails above rustled like distant leaves. Somewhere nearby, a crow landed on the mast and watched the conversation with clear interest. Sproutlyn looked again at the garden, at the compass, at the endless water beyond the ship. A thought began forming quietly inside her mind. "What if," she said slowly, "gardening and navigation are the same thing?" Mangolius's eyes sparkled. "Ah," he said, "now the voyage may begin." Behind them, the harbour of the Dock of Listening continued its peaceful morning routine. At the Black Orchid Café, someone laughed. In the amphitheatre beyond, a storyteller was already preparing for the day's gathering. And out on the water, the currents of the Ocean of Parc shifted ever so slightly, because the ship Egabrag had just welcomed its newest navigator, and the ocean, as always, was listening. Chapter 2 will be the Ocean of Parc, where Mangolius begins teaching Sproutlyn how currents, wind and tides mirror the emotional and energetic currents of life. Chapter 2, the Ocean of Parc. Morning had now fully awakened the Dock of Listening, though it never awakened in a hurry. The harbour of Parc did not believe in rushing. Rushing was something that happened in cities far inland, where people tried to control time like a stubborn mule. Along the coast, however, time behaved more like the tide, sometimes quick, sometimes slow, but always moving according to rhythms far older than schedules. From the terrace of the Black Orchid Café, warm laughter drifted across the dock. Cups clinked gently against saucers. Someone was playing a soft melody on a wooden flute that sounded as though it had learned its notes from seabirds. Sproutlyn stood near the railing of Egabrag, looking outward. The Ocean of Parc stretched endlessly toward the horizon, a vast sheet of living movement. Sunlight scattered across the water like handfuls of shattered mirrors, while distant currents traced slow, invisible paths beneath the surface. At first glance, the ocean appeared calm, but Sproutlyn had already begun to notice something peculiar. The water moved in layers. Small ripples danced along the surface, gentle swells rolled beneath them, and somewhere deeper a slow, powerful pull seemed to guide everything in directions that could not quite be seen. She leaned forward thoughtfully. "It looks peaceful," she said. Mangolius Draconium stood beside the mast, adjusting one of the small lanterns that hung above the garden beds. "Yes," he said, "it often does." Sproutlyn squinted at the water. "But it also looks complicated." Mangolius smiled. "Also correct." He walked slowly to the railing and stood beside her. For a few moments neither of them spoke. They simply watched. A gull circled overhead. A fishing boat glided quietly past the outer harbour. The tide whispered against the dock pylons like a story half-remembered. Finally, Mangolius spoke. "Tell me, Sproutlyn," he said gently. "What do you see?" Sproutlyn pointed. "Water." Mangolius waited. Sproutlyn looked more carefully. "Well, waves." Mangolius nodded. "Continue." Sproutlyn leaned farther over the railing. "I see small ripples and bigger swells underneath them." Mangolius gestured toward the horizon. "And beyond that?" Sproutlyn narrowed her eyes. "The horizon." Mangolius chuckled softly. "Yes, which is the ocean's favorite trick." Sproutlyn tilted her head. "What trick?" Mangolius rested his hands on the railing. "The horizon always looks like the end of the world." "But it never is." Sproutlyn considered this. "That's slightly rude of the ocean." Mangolius laughed. "Perhaps." They continued watching the water. After a moment, Mangolius reached into a wooden crate and pulled out a small bowl of soil from the garden. He placed it carefully on the railing. Sproutlyn looked at it curiously. "Why are we bringing dirt into an ocean lesson?" Mangolius simply pointed. "Watch." A light breeze passed across the deck. The leaves of the herbs rustled softly. Mangolius gently tipped the bowl of soil so that its surface tilted slightly. Sproutlyn watched as a few loose grains rolled downward along the slope. Mangolius then straightened the bowl again. The soil settled. "What did you see?" he asked. Sproutlyn shrugged. "The soil moved when you tilted it." Mangolius nodded. "Now look again." He pointed toward the ocean. A long swell rolled slowly across the harbour. Another followed behind it, and another. The water moved not randomly, but in long, slow pulses. Sproutlyn's eyes widened slightly. "It's doing the same thing." Mangolius nodded again. "Everything in Parc moves in currents." He tapped the soil gently. "Soil!" He gestured to the water. "Water!" Then he tapped his own chest. "And thought." Sproutlyn blinked. "Thought?" Mangolius leaned back against the railing. "Yes, thought moves in currents. Emotion moves in currents. Habit moves in currents." Sproutlyn looked back at the water. "So life is like an ocean?" Mangolius smiled. "Not exactly." Sproutlyn frowned. "It's not." Mangolius shook his head slightly. "No, life is an ocean." Sproutlyn watched the slow rolling swells. "If that's true," she said slowly, "then most people are floating around without realizing it." Mangolius nodded. "Also correct." Sproutlyn crossed her arms thoughtfully. "So what do navigators actually do?" Mangolius pointed toward the horizon. "They read patterns." He pointed toward the wind stirring the sails. "They feel forces." Then he pointed toward the garden beds. "And they cultivate stability." Sproutlyn looked at the herbs swaying gently beside them. "Gardening again?" Mangolius smiled. "Yes, gardening again." Sproutlyn looked back at the water. A small fishing boat nearby began adjusting its sail. The wind had shifted slightly. The boat slowly turned its direction without any dramatic movement, just a gentle, intelligent adjustment. Sproutlyn watched this carefully. "They didn't fight the wind." Mangolius nodded. "They worked with it." Sproutlyn thought for a moment. "So navigating life is not about forcing things?" Mangolius shook his head. "No. It is about reading currents." He gestured toward the water again. "Look closely." Sproutlyn leaned over the railing once more. This time she noticed something she had not seen before. Two currents intersected near the harbour entrance. Where they met, the water formed a small spiral pattern before smoothing out again. "That's strange," she said. Mangolius smiled knowingly. "That is where two forces meet." Sproutlyn studied the swirling water. "So life probably has those too." Mangolius nodded. "Many. Desire meets resistance. Dream meets doubt. Fear meets courage." Sproutlyn watched the spiral dissolve back into smooth water. What happens when currents collide? Mangolius looked at the horizon. Sometimes turbulence, sometimes transformation. The wind lifted slightly, carrying the scent of roasted herbs from the Black Orchid Cafe across the dock. Sproutlyn inhaled deeply. That cafe always smells like important conversations. Mangolius chuckled. It often hosts them. Sproutlyn looked back at the ocean. For the first time, she noticed that the water no longer looked empty. It looked alive, full of movement, full of patterns, full of hidden forces quietly shaping everything that travelled across it. "Does the ocean ever stop moving?" she asked. Mangolius shook his head. "Never." Sproutlyn sighed thoughtfully. "So life is basically a giant moving garden on a moving ocean." Mangolius smiled broadly. "That may be the most accurate description anyone has given so far." Sproutlyn looked at the horizon again. Something inside her shifted slightly. The world no longer seemed like a place filled with random events. It looked more like a system of currents waiting to be understood. Behind them, the harbour continued its gentle morning life. At the Black Orchid Cafe, another round of tea was being poured. In the amphitheatre beyond the cafe, someone was already telling a story about a sailor who once tried to argue with the wind and lost spectacularly. And out beyond the harbour, the vast Ocean of Parc continued its slow, patient breathing, currents moving, tides turning, patterns unfolding, waiting, as always, for someone curious enough to notice. Sproutlyn looked at Mangolius with quiet excitement. "I think I'm beginning to understand." Mangolius nodded. "Good." He gestured toward the garden beds behind them. "Because next," he said gently, "we learn how roots navigate." Sproutlyn blinked. "Roots navigate?" Mangolius smiled. "Oh, yes! The most ancient navigators of all. Chapter 3, The Compass and the Roots, where Sproutlyn discovers that plants may actually be some of the greatest navigators in existence." Chapter 3, The Compass and the Roots. The morning sun had climbed higher now, spreading soft gold across the waters of the Ocean of Parc. Light shimmered across the harbour like 1,000 tiny lanterns drifting just beneath the surface. The breeze carried the smell of salt, moss, and something warm and fragrant from the kitchen windows of the Black Orchid Cafe. Sproutlyn suspected someone inside was baking something delightful. Possibly cinnamon bark pastries? Possibly roasted root cakes? Possibly both. But for the moment her attention remained firmly fixed on the deck of Egabrag, where Mangolius Draconium had just made a rather puzzling statement. "The greatest navigators in existence," he had said calmly, "are roots." Sproutlyn stared at him. "Roots don't move." Mangolius raised one eyebrow gently. "Are you sure?" Sproutlyn looked down at the garden beds. The herbs swayed quietly in the breeze. The soil appeared perfectly still. She tapped one of the wooden planter boxes. "Very sure." Mangolius chuckled. "Ah, but movement is not always visible." He crouched beside one of the larger garden beds and carefully pressed his staff into the soil. With slow patience, he loosened a small patch of earth near the edge of a thriving rosemary plant. Sproutlyn leaned closer. The soil shifted slightly, and there, just beneath the surface, she saw them. Roots. Dozens of them. Thin, pale threads branching outward like tiny rivers exploring dark land. Sproutlyn blinked. "Well," she said, "they look like noodles." Mangolius laughed. "That is one way to describe them." He brushed a bit more soil aside, revealing the intricate network. The roots were not random. They curved, they split, they reached in specific directions. Some extended downward, others moved sideways through the soil, weaving carefully around small stones and pockets of moisture. Sproutlyn leaned in even closer. "They're searching," she said quietly. Mangolius nodded. "Yes. For water, for nutrients, for space, for balance." Sproutlyn watched the network carefully. The roots moved with quiet determination, spreading through the soil like explorers mapping an underground continent. "How do they know where to go?" she asked. Mangolius stood and walked to the navigation table near the helm. There he lifted the small brass compass and brought it over. The needle trembled softly as he held it between them. "This," he said, "points north." Sproutlyn nodded. "Yes, but how?" Sproutlyn frowned. "Well, that's just what compasses do." Mangolius smiled knowingly. "Yes, and roots do the same thing." Sproutlyn blinked. "They point north?" Mangolius shook his head. No, they point truth. Sproutlyn stared at the compass, then at the roots, then back at Mangolius. That sounds suspiciously poetic, Mangolius chuckled. Most accurate things do. He gently placed the compass beside the exposed root system. Both of these systems seek orientation, he continued. The compass aligns with the Earth's magnetic field. The roots align with gravity, moisture, minerals, and subtle signals within the soil. Sproutlyn crossed her arms thoughtfully. So both are finding direction. Mangolius nodded. Exactly. He pointed toward the soil again. Roots grow toward what sustains life. Then he tapped the compass. And navigators steer toward what sustains the journey. Sproutlyn crouched beside the garden bed again. She watched the roots more carefully now. Each one was moving with quiet intention, even though the movement was far too slow to see in real time. But somehow the plant knew. How do they know? She asked softly. Mangolius leaned on his staff. That question has fascinated philosophers, botanists, sailors, and wandering thinkers for centuries. Sproutlyn looked up. And? Mangolius shrugged slightly. We still do not fully know. Sproutlyn blinked. That's unsatisfying. Mangolius laughed. It is also honest. A breeze drifted across the deck. The leaves of the garden rustled like soft applause. Mangolius gestured toward the plants. These roots are constantly sensing pressure, moisture, minerals, temperature. They are listening to the soil. Sproutlyn tilted her head. Listening? Mangolius nodded. Yes. The soil speaks in chemistry and subtle signals. Sproutlyn looked impressed. So roots are basically underground detectives. Mangolius chuckled. That is an excellent description. Sproutlyn stood and looked out toward the ocean again. Then people must have roots too. Mangolius watched her carefully. Yes! Sproutlyn looked down at her feet. Her small mandrake roots curled gently along the wooden deck. But we don't grow into soil like plants do. Mangolius nodded. No. But we grow into values. Sproutlyn considered this. Values? Mangolius tapped the compass again. What keeps a navigator steady during a storm? Sproutlyn thought. The compass. And what keeps a person steady during life? Sproutlyn hesitated. Then her eyes widened slightly. Oh, Mangolius smiled. Yes. Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. So values are like internal compasses. Mangolius nodded. And like roots. Sproutlyn looked back at the soil bed. The roots were hidden again beneath the earth, but now she could imagine them stretching quietly through the darkness, feeling their way toward nourishment. What happens, she asked slowly, if roots grow in the wrong direction? Mangolius leaned back against the railing. The plant becomes unstable, and if a compass is broken, the ship becomes lost. Sproutlyn looked out over the endless Ocean of Parc. Wind stirred the sails gently above them. Small boats moved along the horizon like drifting seeds. So the secret to navigation, she said thoughtfully, is knowing what your roots are connected to. Mangolius nodded. Precisely. From the dock behind them came the sound of cheerful conversation. The doors of the Black Orchid Cafe had opened fully now. Morning patrons were stepping outside with cups of tea, enjoying the sun and watching the harbour come alive. A musician had begun playing a soft tune on a violin. Its notes drifted across the water like tiny floating lanterns. Sproutlyn listened for a moment. Conversations there always seem important, she said. Mangolius smiled. They often plant seeds. Sproutlyn nodded slowly. She looked once more at the compass, then at the soil, then at the wide open sea. A quiet realization settled inside her mind like a stone dropping gently into clear water. If someone doesn't know their roots, she said softly, they probably won't know where they're going. Mangolius rested his staff against the deck. That, he said warmly, is the beginning of wisdom. The wind shifted again. The sails of Egabrag fluttered softly. Somewhere beneath the surface of the Ocean of Parc, invisible currents continued their slow, patient dance, and within the quiet soil of the ship's garden, the roots kept growing, always searching, always orienting, always listening. Mangolius looked toward the mast where the sails stretched wide above them. Next, he said, we learn about leaves. Sproutlyn blinked. Leaves? Mangolius nodded. Yes, the parts of the plant that catch the invisible. Sproutlyn looked up at the sails. They billowed gently in the wind. Her eyes widened. Oh, Mangolius smiled. Yes, exactly. Chapter 4 will be one of the most beautiful metaphors in the story, the sail and the leaves, where Sproutlyn discovers that both sails and leaves harvest invisible forces to create movement and life. Chapter 4, the sail and the leaves. By late morning, the harbour had taken on that gentle hum of activity that made the Dock of Listening feel less like a workplace and more like a living organism stretching itself awake. The windows of the Black Orchid Cafe glowed warmly in the sunlight. Laughter spilled from the terrace where small groups of travellers leaned over their tables, cups of tea steaming like tiny clouds between them. The smell of toasted seed bread drifted across the dock. Someone had begun roasting citrus peel. Sproutlyn suspected the cafe had a secret talent for making curiosity smell delicious. But today her attention was drawn upward, very upward. Above the deck of Egabrag, the great white sails had finally been loosened. They now stretched wide against the sky, gently breathing with the wind. The sound they made was soft and rhythmic. Whuff, rustle, whuff, almost like giant leaves moving through invisible air. Sproutlyn stood near the mast, head tilted back, eyes wide. Mangolius Draconium stood beside her, hands resting calmly on his staff. For several moments neither spoke. The sails swelled outward as a stronger breeze passed through the harbour. The ship shifted slightly. Sproutlyn blinked. We moved. Mangolius nodded. Yes, but the ocean didn't push us. No, and nobody pulled any ropes. No. Sproutlyn looked up again. So the sails did it! Mangolius smiled. Yes, Sproutlyn squinted at them. But the wind is invisible. Mangolius raised one finger. Correct. Sproutlyn crossed her arms thoughtfully. So the sails are catching something we can't see. Mangolius nodded. Exactly. He gestured toward the garden beds nearby. And what do leaves catch? Sproutlyn looked at the plants. Sunlight poured down across the herbs, making their leaves glow faintly green. Light, she said. Mangolius smiled. And light is what? Sproutlyn hesitated. Well, sunlight. Mangolius chuckled. Yes, but also something invisible. Sproutlyn blinked. How can sunlight be invisible? Mangolius leaned on the railing. Most of it is. Sproutlyn looked suspicious. That sounds like trickery. Mangolius laughed. Only if one insists on seeing everything. He picked up a small leaf from a fallen sprig of mint and held it between his fingers. Leaves capture light energy. They turn it into sugar. They turn that sugar into growth. Sproutlyn nodded slowly. That's photosynthesis. Mangolius looked pleasantly surprised. Well done, Sproutlyn shrugged modestly. I once attended a very enthusiastic lecture in the amphitheatre. Mangolius chuckled. Excellent place for enthusiastic lectures. He pointed upward toward the sails again. Sails do something similar. Sproutlyn looked confused. They make sugar? Mangolius laughed heartily. No, they capture movement. The wind picked up slightly, pushing the sails outward. Egabrag shifted again, gliding a few inches along the gentle harbour current. Sproutlyn's eyes widened. The wind is pushing us. Mangolius shook his head. No. Sproutlyn blinked. It isn't. Mangolius pointed at the sails. The sails are receiving the wind. Sproutlyn looked puzzled. That seems like the same thing. Mangolius shook his head again. No, receiving and forcing are very different. Sproutlyn leaned against the railing thoughtfully. The breeze flowed across the harbour, stirring the water, rustling the garden leaves and swelling the sails in slow rhythmic pulses. So sails don't create the wind. No, and leaves don't create the sun. No, but both use those forces. Yes. Sproutlyn stared at the sails, then at the leaves, then back at the sails. A thought was forming. That means life runs on invisible things. Mangolius nodded. Very much so. He began counting gently on his fingers. Wind, sunlight, gravity, emotion, imagination. Sproutlyn blinked. Emotion is invisible? Mangolius raised an eyebrow. Have you ever seen one? Sproutlyn paused. No, yet you feel them. Sproutlyn nodded slowly. That's slightly unsettling. Mangolius chuckled. It is also very useful. Sproutlyn watched the sails again. The wind shifted. Egabrag gently pivoted against its mooring rope. A passing gull rode the air currents with effortless grace. That bird is using the wind too, Sproutlyn observed. Mangolius nodded. Yes, and it barely flaps its wings. Correct. Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. So the smartest flyers don't fight the wind. Mangolius smiled. They cooperate with it. Sproutlyn leaned on the railing, staring out over the Ocean of Parc. Small waves shimmered in the sunlight like scattered jewels. Far beyond the harbour entrance, the open sea stretched endlessly. Is life like that too? She asked quietly. Mangolius followed her gaze. Yes, Sproutlyn tilted her head. So if someone tries to force everything, they'll probably get tired. Mangolius nodded. Very. And if they learn to catch the wind instead, Mangolius smiled warmly, they travel farther. Behind them, a burst of laughter erupted from the terrace of the Black Orchid Cafe. Someone had clearly told a very good story. The smell of roasted cinnamon bark drifted across the dock. Sproutlyn inhaled deeply. That cafe seems to capture invisible things, too, Mangolius chuckled. Indeed. Sproutlyn gestured toward it. Conversations. Mangolius nodded. Yes, and ideas. Yes, and inspiration. Mangolius smiled broadly. Precisely. Sproutlyn looked back at the sails once more. The wind flowed through them like a quiet river made of air. She looked at the leaves of the garden. They shimmered in the sunlight, quietly drinking in energy, and suddenly something inside her mind clicked into place. Life isn't powered by effort alone, she said softly. Mangolius tilted his head approvingly. No, it is powered by alignment with invisible forces. Sproutlyn smiled slowly. That sounds much easier than trying to push the ocean. Mangolius laughed. Yes, that tends to end poorly. The wind lifted again, the sails filled gently, the leaves rustled, and the ship Egabrag seemed to breathe with the world around it. Sproutlyn looked at the garden thoughtfully. So roots orient us. Mangolius nodded. Yes, and leaves receive energy. Yes, Sproutlyn looked back at the sails, and sails move us. Mangolius smiled. You are learning quickly. Sproutlyn grinned. This is the most interesting ship I have ever been on. Mangolius leaned on his staff. Wait until you see the harbour. Sproutlyn blinked. I thought we were already in the harbour. Mangolius gestured toward the shore. Beyond the Black Orchid Cafe, the curved stone seats of the Amphitheatre of Echoing Wisdom rose like a giant listening ear carved into the earth. Figures were already gathering there. Travellers, philosophers, storytellers, a musician tuning a strange stringed instrument. That, Mangolius said, is where wind becomes wisdom. Sproutlyn looked intrigued. How? Mangolius smiled. Stories. Sproutlyn's leafy hair rustled with excitement. Oh, good. I love stories, Mangolius nodded. Then you will enjoy what comes next. He turned toward the dock. Because before Egabrag sails, he said gently, we visit the Black Orchid Cafe. Sproutlyn's eyes widened. The place that smells like cinnamon bark pastries? Mangolius smiled. The very same. Sproutlyn brightened instantly. Well then, she said, navigation clearly requires snacks. Mangolius chuckled. An excellent philosophy. Next chapter will be a beautiful one. Chapter 5. The Black Orchid Cafe, where Sproutlyn experiences the cafe as a place where ideas are planted like seeds, and where travellers unknowingly shape the courses of future voyages. Chapter 5. The Black Orchid Cafe. By the time Sproutlyn and Mangolius stepped off the gangplank of Egabrag, the dock of listening had fully awakened into its gentle daytime rhythm. Sunlight now streamed across the harbour like liquid gold, poured slowly over wood and water. The tide had risen just enough to lift the moored ships into a quiet, rocking motion, as though the entire harbour were breathing. Sproutlyn paused halfway down the dock. The smell reached her first. Warm, spiced, deep and earthy with a hint of citrus brightness. Her leafy hair lifted slightly in the breeze. That, she said with complete certainty, is cinnamon bark pastry. Mangolius smiled without looking at her. Your navigational instincts are developing. Sproutlyn straightened proudly. Excellent. He gestured toward the large wooden doors just ahead. Above them hung a carved sign, worn smooth by years of sea air and wandering hands. Painted carefully across the dark wood were 3 elegant words, the Black Orchid Cafe. The letters curled like vines. Small carved flowers decorated the border of the sign, each petal etched with intricate care. The orchids themselves seemed almost alive, as though they had been captured mid-bloom. Sproutlyn tilted her head. Why black orchids? Mangolius opened the door. Because rare things grow in unusual places. Warm air spilled outward, wrapping around them like a friendly blanket. Inside, the cafe glowed with lantern light and polished wood. Tall windows looked out across the harbour, framing the endless horizon of the Ocean of Parc like living paintings. The room hummed with quiet conversation. Travellers sat at round wooden tables worn smooth by decades of elbows, notebooks, maps, and cups of tea. Some spoke quietly, some laughed loudly, some simply listened. Sproutlyn stepped inside slowly, eyes wide. Shelves lined the walls, filled not with books exactly, but with objects. Old compasses, small glass jars of curious seeds, feathers, seashells, weathered notebooks, tiny carved figurines. Each object looked like it carried a story waiting patiently to be told. "Is this a cafe or a museum?" Sproutlyn whispered. Mangolius leaned toward her. "Both." A server passed by carrying a tray filled with steaming mugs. Sproutlyn caught the scent of roasted chicory, clove, and something sweet she could not quite identify. Her stomach made a small, hopeful noise. Mangolius pretended not to notice. They found a small table near the open windows where the ocean breeze drifted gently through the room. Sproutlyn climbed into her chair and looked around eagerly. At the next table sat two sailors arguing cheerfully over a map. Across the room, a group of travelers discussed something animatedly involving star charts and migration patterns. Near the far wall, an elderly woman with silver hair wrote quietly in a thick leather notebook. Sproutlyn leaned closer to Mangolius. "Everyone here looks like they're thinking about something important." Mangolius nodded. "That is one of the cafe's specialties." A server approached their table carrying 2 cups, one large, one very small. The larger cup steamed richly with dark herbal brew. The smaller one smelled unmistakably like cinnamon bark pastry tea. Sproutlyn's eyes sparkled. "Navigation clearly improves with tea." Mangolius chuckled. "It improves with conversation." Sproutlyn blew gently on her cup. "Those 2 things seem related." Mangolius took a slow sip from his mug. "Tell me something, Sproutlyn." She looked up. "Yes. Where do ideas come from?" Sproutlyn blinked. "Well, from thinking." Mangolius shook his head gently. "Partly," he gestured around the cafe, "but mostly from meeting." Sproutlyn looked around again. People were talking everywhere. Stories, experiences, questions, laughter, debate. Ideas seemed to move through the room like invisible birds flying between the tables. "They're sharing thoughts," she said. Mangolius nodded. "Yes. Every voyage begins with a conversation." Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. "So ships start sailing here?" Mangolius smiled. "Often." He gestured toward the objects lining the shelves. "Each of those items represents a story that began with someone sitting at one of these tables." Sproutlyn noticed a small brass sextant mounted beside the window. "What about that one?" Mangolius looked at it fondly. "A sailor once learned the stars here." Sproutlyn pointed to a jar of bright blue seeds. "And those?" "A gardener discovered a new species after hearing a story told right over there." Sproutlyn leaned back in her chair. "So this place is like a seed garden for ideas." Mangolius's eyes sparkled. "Exactly." Sproutlyn sipped her tea thoughtfully. The warm cinnamon flavor filled her mouth like a small celebration. She looked out the window toward the harbor. From here she could see Egabrag resting calmly beside the dock. Its sails stirred gently in the wind. Its garden glowed softly in the sunlight. "I think I understand something," she said slowly. Mangolius waited. "The ocean teaches through experience." Mangolius nodded. "Yes." "The garden teaches through cultivation." "Yes." Sproutlyn gestured around the cafe. "And this place teaches through conversation." Mangolius smiled warmly. "Well said." A sudden burst of applause came from outside. Sproutlyn turned toward the open windows. Down the stone path beyond the cafe, the amphitheater of echoing wisdom was beginning to fill. Travelers were gathering on the curved stone steps. Someone had just finished telling a story that apparently ended very well. Sproutlyn leaned toward the window. "What's happening there?" Mangolius glanced outside. "The afternoon storytelling." Sproutlyn's eyes widened. "That sounds delightful." Mangolius stood. "It is also educational." Sproutlyn slid down from her chair. "Do they serve pastries there?" Mangolius laughed. "No." Sproutlyn considered this. "Well, then we should bring some." Mangolius placed a few coins on the table. "A wise navigator plans ahead." Sproutlyn grabbed the small paper bag the server had quietly placed beside her tea. Inside were 3 cinnamon bark pastries. She beamed. "I am beginning to like navigation very much." Mangolius opened the cafe door. Bright sunlight poured inside. The ocean breeze carried the distant sound of voices from the amphitheater. Sproutlyn followed him out onto the dock. Behind them, the warm glow of the Black Orchid Cafe continued to hum with conversation. Inside, ideas were still being planted. Questions were still being asked. Seeds of voyages not yet imagined were quietly taking root. And outside, the path toward the amphitheater of echoing wisdom curved gently along the shoreline. Mangolius began walking. Sproutlyn followed eagerly, pastry in hand. "Are the stories there about sailing?" she asked. Mangolius smiled. "Sometimes. And sometimes about life." Sproutlyn took a thoughtful bite of pastry. "Well," she said through a mouthful of cinnamon sweetness, "those sound suspiciously similar." Mangolius laughed softly. "Yes, they are." Ahead of them, the amphitheatre buzzed with anticipation. Voices echoed softly across the stone bowl. Stories were about to begin, and Sproutlyn was about to learn something important. Because stories, much like seeds, have a way of growing long after they are heard. Next will be one of the most magical chapters in the book. Chapter 6. The Amphitheatre of Echoing Wisdom, where Sproutlyn learns how stories like sound waves across time, shaping decisions long after they are spoken. Chapter 6. The Amphitheatre of Echoing Wisdom. The path from the Black Orc Cafe to the amphitheatre curved gently along the shoreline, like a thoughtful sentence that preferred to unfold slowly rather than rush to its conclusion. Sproutlyn followed Mangolius down the worn stone steps, still holding her small paper bag of cinnamon bark pastries with great responsibility. The harbour breeze tugged playfully at her leafy hair, while the scent of sea air mingled with roasted herbs drifting from the cafe behind them. Ahead, the amphitheatre of echoing wisdom revealed itself fully. It was not built in the way most structures were built. No straight walls or rigid edges defined it. Instead, it seemed as though the earth itself had once decided to listen more carefully. The ground curved inward like a great cupped ear. Stone seats spiraled downward in wide arcs toward a circular stage at the center. Each row was carved smooth by time and countless listeners who had come before. Sproutlyn stopped halfway down the steps and stared. "Oh!" Mangolius paused beside her. "Yes," he said softly. "Oh!" From above, the amphitheatre resembled the ripples that form when a pebble falls into still water. Concentric rings spreading outward, each row held travellers of every sort. Sailors with sun-browned faces, gardeners with soil still under their fingernails, philosophers clutching notebooks, artists sketching quietly in charcoal. Even a few curious birds had perched along the upper edges, apparently quite fond of a good story. At the centre stage stood a tall woman wrapped in a cloak the colour of deep twilight. She held no instruments, no scrolls, no notes, yet the entire amphitheatre listened as though gravity itself depended on her next words. Sproutlyn whispered to Mangolius, "Who is she?" Mangolius leaned toward her. "A storyteller." Sproutlyn frowned slightly. "That seems ordinary." Mangolius smiled knowingly. "Wait," the storyteller began. Her voice carried easily across the amphitheatre, flowing outward in clear ripples of sound. "Many years ago," she said, "a sailor once attempted to command the wind." A small ripple of laughter moved through the audience. The storyteller continued, "He shouted at the sky. 'Blow harder,' he demanded. 'Blow the direction I say!' The amphitheatre chuckled softly. Sproutlyn leaned forward. 'He argued with the wind for 3 days. On the 4th day,' the storyteller said, the wind continued doing exactly what it had always done." More laughter. "The sailor, however, was exhausted." Sproutlyn grinned. "That sounds predictable." Mangolius nodded. "Many lessons are." The storyteller lifted a small wooden model of a sailboat. "Eventually," she said, "a quiet navigator approached the sailor and offered a suggestion." The storyteller lowered her voice slightly. "Perhaps instead of shouting at the wind, you could learn to use it." A murmur of recognition passed through the audience. Sproutlyn's eyes widened. "That's exactly what you said about sails." Mangolius nodded gently. "Wisdom travels well." The storyteller set the tiny boat on the stage, and so the sailor learned something important. She spread her arms wide. "The wind cannot be commanded, but it can be understood." Her voice echoed beautifully along the curved stone walls. The amphitheatre seemed designed for exactly this moment. Words did not merely travel through the air here, they expanded. Sproutlyn noticed it immediately. The sound rolled outward like waves across water. Each sentence reached every listener, bounced gently from the stone walls and returned again like a thoughtful echo. She leaned toward Mangolius. "It sounds bigger here." Mangolius nodded. "That is the purpose of amphitheatres. To amplify, to reflect." Sproutlyn blinked. "What's the difference?" Mangolius pointed toward the stone walls around them. "These walls catch sound and return it." Sproutlyn listened carefully. The storyteller's voice indeed seemed to return moments later, softer but still clear. "It's like a conversation with the past," she whispered. Mangolius smiled warmly. "Exactly." The storyteller finished her tale, and the sailor eventually became one of the finest navigators on Parc, not because he controlled the wind, but because he learned to listen. The amphitheatre erupted into warm applause. Sproutlyn clapped enthusiastically. "That was excellent." Mangolius chuckled. "Yes." Sproutlyn looked around the stone bowl. "So stories are like sound waves." Mangolius nodded. They travel. Sproutlyn pointed to the curved seating. "And the amphitheatre helps them go farther." "Yes," Sproutlyn thought for a moment. "Does that mean stories keep moving long after they're told?" Mangolius leaned on his staff. "Yes." He gestured toward the harbour beyond the amphitheatre. "Someone might hear a story today, then remember it during a storm 10 years from now." Sproutlyn's eyes widened. "So stories are like navigation tools." Mangolius smiled. "Precisely." The storyteller stepped down from the stage as another speaker prepared to begin. A young traveller carrying a worn leather journal approached the centre. Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. "So the cafe plants ideas." Mangolius nodded. "Yes." "And the amphitheatre spreads them." "Yes." Sproutlyn glanced toward the harbour. "And the ocean tests them." Mangolius rested a hand gently on her shoulder. "You are learning the system." Sproutlyn looked proud. "I enjoy systems." She took another bite of pastry thoughtfully. The cinnamon warmth seemed to match the sunlight now pouring into the amphitheatre. For a moment she simply listened. Waves rolled softly along the distant shoreline. The wind moved gently through the grasses above the amphitheatre walls. Voices rose and fell as the next storyteller began. Sproutlyn felt something inside her mind settling into place, like soil being gently smoothed before planting. "Stories," she said quietly, "help people see patterns." Mangolius nodded. "Yes." Sproutlyn looked back toward the ship Egabrag, resting patiently at the dock. The sails shimmered in the afternoon light. "And patterns help people navigate." Mangolius smiled. "Exactly." Sproutlyn leaned back on the stone seat. "I think I'm starting to understand the harbour." Mangolius raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Sproutlyn counted on her fingers. "The garden teaches cultivation. The ocean teaches experience. The cafe teaches conversation. The amphitheatre teaches reflection." Mangolius nodded approvingly. "Very good," Sproutlyn grinned. "So the harbour is basically a school." Mangolius chuckled. "One without exams." Sproutlyn relaxed happily. "That sounds ideal." The wind lifted gently again, carrying his voice across the stone bowl. Somewhere behind them, the bells of the Black Orchid Cafe rang softly as another guest entered. The harbour lived, the ocean breathed, and the amphitheatre continued doing what it had done for generations, turning stories into echoes, turning echoes into insight, turning insight into journeys. Mangolius rose slowly. Sproutlyn looked up. "Are we leaving already?" Mangolius nodded toward the harbour. "Yes." Sproutlyn followed his gaze. Egabrag waited quietly beside the dock. Its garden shimmered softly in the sunlight. "The ocean is patient," Mangolius said, "but voyagers prefer not to wait forever." Sproutlyn stood eagerly. "Good." She brushed crumbs from her tunic. "I think I'm ready for the next lesson." Mangolius smiled. "And what do you think that might be?" Sproutlyn thought carefully. "Well," she looked at the harbour, at the amphitheatre, at the cafe, at the ship. "I think we should learn how maps work." Mangolius's eyes sparkled. "An excellent guess. Next comes a very thoughtful chapter. Chapter 7. The Map and the Garden Plan, where Sproutlyn discovers that maps and garden layouts both answer the same question. Where should things grow, and where should we go? Chapter 7. The Map and the Garden Plan. The afternoon sun had begun its slow, thoughtful drift westward when Sproutlyn and Mangolius returned to the harbour. The dock of listening had settled into its quieter rhythm now. The morning bustle had softened into the gentle hum of steady activity. At the Black Orchid Cafe, the lanterns hanging beneath the awning glowed softly even in daylight. Conversations had grown deeper, slower, like tea steeping long enough to release its full flavour. A group of travellers leaned over a wide table near the window, studying what looked like an enormous weathered map. Their fingers traced coastlines while their voices drifted outward through the open doors. Sproutlyn watched them with curiosity as she followed Mangolius along the dock. Maps seem very serious, she said. Mangolius glanced toward the table inside the cafe. They are. Sproutlyn tilted her head. Why? Mangolius gestured toward the Ocean of Parc. Because the ocean does not come with instructions. Sproutlyn looked at the endless water. That seems slightly inconsiderate of it. Mangolius chuckled. The ocean is not responsible for our confusion. They reached the gangplank of Egabrag, which creaked gently as the ship shifted with the tide. Sproutlyn stepped aboard with growing familiarity. Already the garden beds felt a little like home. The herbs swayed softly in the afternoon breeze. Tiny bees moved lazily among the flowering plants, clearly unaware that they were part of a grand navigational metaphor. Mangolius walked to the navigation table near the helm. There he carefully unrolled something long and wide across the wooden surface. Sproutlyn leaned forward eagerly. It was a map. Not a small one, not even a moderately large one. This was a map that appeared to have been made by someone who believed the world deserved to be drawn properly. The parchment stretched across nearly the entire table, its surface filled with intricate ink lines and faded colours. Coastlines curved like sleeping dragons. Small islands dotted the sea like scattered seeds. Curving arrows traced ocean currents. Tiny symbols marked reefs, shoals, and mysterious areas labelled with curious notes. Sproutlyn's eyes widened. This is magnificent. Mangolius nodded. Maps often are. Sproutlyn ran her finger lightly along one of the coastlines. What is this area called? Mangolius leaned over her shoulder. That is the western shelf of Parc. Sproutlyn followed a dotted line that wound through several small islands. And this? The wandering archipelago. Sproutlyn blinked. Islands wander? Mangolius smiled. Some do. Sproutlyn nodded solemnly. Of course they do. She looked closer. The map was filled with markings that clearly represented years of observation. Currents drawn in sweeping arcs, wind patterns sketched in pale blue lines, symbols for safe harbours, warnings for dangerous reefs, notes written carefully in small, precise handwriting. Someone spent a long time making this, Sproutlyn said quietly. Mangolius nodded. Yes, Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. So maps are made from experience, Mangolius smiled. Exactly. He tapped one of the drawn current arrows. This line represents hundreds of voyages. Sproutlyn leaned closer. Hundreds? Yes. Sproutlyn looked impressed. That is a lot of sailing, Mangolius chuckled. Navigation rewards patience. Sproutlyn studied the map carefully, then her gaze drifted to the garden beds. Something occurred to her. She walked over to the central planter box and looked down at the carefully arranged rows of herbs. Basil in one section, mint in another. Rosemary climbing the small trellis. The layout was not random. Each plant had been placed with intention. She turned back toward Mangolius. The garden has a map too. Mangolius raised an eyebrow. Oh, Sproutlyn pointed. Those plants are arranged in rows. Yes, and the taller ones are near the mast, where they get more sun. Yes, and the herbs that like shade are closer to the railing. Mangolius smiled broadly. Sproutlyn continued. You planned where everything grows. Mangolius nodded. That is called a garden plan. Sproutlyn returned to the navigation table. So maps and garden plans do the same thing. Mangolius tilted his head. What do they do? Sproutlyn tapped the map. They show where things are. Then she pointed toward the garden and where things should go. Mangolius leaned on his staff approvingly. Very good. Sproutlyn folded her arms thoughtfully. So before a ship sails, someone studies a map. Yes. And before planting a garden, someone studies the land. Yes. Sproutlyn looked pleased. That makes sense. Mangolius nodded. It prevents many problems. Sproutlyn examined the map again. What happens if someone sails without one? Mangolius shrugged slightly. They may still arrive somewhere. Sproutlyn blinked. That sounds optimistic. Mangolius chuckled. But it may not be where they intended. Sproutlyn considered this. So a map is basically a collection of lessons learned by people who went before. Mangolius smiled. Yes. Sproutlyn looked toward the harbour. She could see the Black Orchid Cafe from the deck. Travellers still gathered around their tables, discussing routes, ideas, and possibilities. And conversations in the cafe probably create maps too. Mangolius nodded. Many voyages begin there. Sproutlyn looked at the amphitheatre beyond the cafe. The stone bowl now glowed softly in the late afternoon sun. And stories there probably add to the map. Mangolius rested his hand on the parchment. Exactly. Sproutlyn smiled slowly. So the harbour is actually a place where maps are made. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn leaned over the parchment again. The map felt less like a drawing now. It felt like a history of journeys. Each line represented someone who had once stood on a deck like this one, studying the horizon and wondering what lay beyond. She traced one of the routes with her finger. Where does this path go? Mangolius followed the line. That route eventually leads to the Northern Passage. Sproutlyn's eyes widened. Have you sailed it? Mangolius nodded calmly. Several times. Sproutlyn looked impressed. Was it difficult? Mangolius smiled. All good journeys are. The wind shifted again, rustling the garden leaves and stirring the sails above. Sproutlyn looked from the map to the garden, to the ocean stretching endlessly ahead. Life probably needs a map, she said softly. Mangolius looked at her with warm approval. Yes, Sproutlyn tilted her head, but I've never seen one. Mangolius tapped the parchment gently. You are looking at it. Sproutlyn blinked. This is a map of Parc. Mangolius nodded. And of life. Sproutlyn stared at the swirling lines of currents and coastlines. Gradually, the meaning settled in. Experience becomes guidance. Mangolius smiled. Yes. Sproutlyn looked toward the amphitheatre again. And stories become landmarks. Yes, Sproutlyn nodded thoughtfully. So if someone listens carefully, Mangolius finished her sentence, they do not have to sail blindly. The late afternoon light shimmered across the ocean like scattered gold dust. The harbour grew quieter as the day leaned gently toward evening. Sproutlyn rolled the map slightly so it wouldn't catch the breeze. This is fascinating, she said. Mangolius chuckled. And useful. Sproutlyn leaned on the railing, gazing at the horizon. So we know our routes. Yes. We catch energy with our sails. Yes. And we study maps before sailing. Mangolius nodded. You are assembling the system. Sproutlyn smiled proudly. Navigation seems much more reasonable now. Mangolius glanced toward the stern of the ship. Good. Sproutlyn followed his gaze. Near the back of the ship, the rudder extended into the water. It moved gently with the current, barely noticeable but quietly powerful. Mangolius rested both hands on his staff. Because next, he said calmly, we learn about small corrections. Sproutlyn squinted toward the rudder. That tiny thing steers the whole ship? Mangolius smiled. Yes. Sproutlyn blinked slowly. That seems suspiciously important. Mangolius chuckled. It is. Next will be a very insightful chapter. Chapter 8, The Rudder and the Pruning Shears, where Sproutlyn learns that tiny adjustments can change the entire direction of a life. Chapter 8, The Rudder and the Pruning Shears. Late afternoon had settled gently across the harbour like a thoughtful pause between sentences. The Ocean of Parc glowed with that particular shade of silver blue that appears only when the sun begins leaning toward the horizon, but has not yet committed to leaving. A breeze drifted slowly across the water, carrying the distant murmur of conversation from the Black Orchid Café. Somewhere inside, someone had begun playing a low, thoughtful melody on a piano that sounded slightly older than the building itself. Sproutlyn stood near the stern of Egabrag, staring intently at something that appeared surprisingly unimpressive. The rudder. It extended down into the water behind the ship like a quiet secret. Small, plain, almost forgettable. Sproutlyn squinted. That's it. Mangolius Draconium stood beside her, hands resting comfortably on his staff. Yes. Sproutlyn leaned over the railing, examining it more closely. That tiny plank controls the whole ship, Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn crossed her arms skeptically. But the ship is enormous. Mangolius looked at the ocean. And the rudder is patient. Sproutlyn frowned slightly. That sounds like a philosophical trick, Mangolius chuckled. Perhaps. He stepped closer to the helm and gently turned the steering handle. The rudder shifted slightly beneath the water. Egabrag responded almost immediately, not dramatically, not suddenly, but subtly. The ship's bow began to drift slowly toward a new angle against the current. Sproutlyn blinked. Oh. Mangolius turned the helm back again. The ship corrected itself. Sproutlyn watched carefully. That barely moved. Mangolius nodded. Yes, and yet the entire ship followed. Sproutlyn leaned against the railing thoughtfully. So small movements create big changes. Mangolius smiled. Exactly. He walked toward the garden beds and picked up a pair of small pruning shears resting beside the rosemary plant. Sproutlyn followed him curiously. Mangolius gently held up a branch of basil. It had grown slightly crooked, leaning sideways across the bed. He snipped one small section, just a tiny piece, hardly noticeable. Sproutlyn tilted her head. "That seems minor." Mangolius nodded. "For now." He pointed to the remaining branch. "This plant will now grow differently." Sproutlyn watched the plant thoughtfully. "Because you removed that one little piece." Mangolius nodded. "Yes." Sproutlyn looked back toward the rudder, "and the rudder does the same thing." Mangolius leaned on the railing. "Small adjustments." Sproutlyn sat on the edge of a planter box. "So navigation is basically a long series of tiny corrections." Mangolius smiled. "Very well said." The breeze lifted slightly, rustling the garden leaves and swelling the sails above. Egabrag rocked gently in the harbour water. Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. "Why don't people do that more often?" Mangolius raised an eyebrow. "Do what?" "Small corrections." Mangolius chuckled softly. "Because many people prefer dramatic changes." Sproutlyn nodded slowly. "That seems inefficient." Mangolius laughed. "It often is." He pointed toward the horizon. "If a ship sails only 1 degree off course—" Sproutlyn waited. Mangolius continued. "It may not matter today." Sproutlyn nodded. "Or tomorrow." Mangolius gestured toward the distant horizon. "But after 1,000 miles," Sproutlyn's eyes widened, "you end up somewhere completely different." Mangolius smiled. "Precisely." Sproutlyn looked at the rudder again. "So good navigation is mostly about paying attention early." Mangolius nodded. "Yes, before the mistake becomes large." Sproutlyn leaned back and stared at the sky. Clouds drifted slowly above the harbour like thoughtful animals wandering across a blue field. "Life probably works like that too." Mangolius rested his staff against the deck. "It does." Sproutlyn thought for a moment. "So if someone notices a small problem early," Mangolius nodded, "they can correct it easily." Sproutlyn smiled. "But if they ignore it," Mangolius chuckled, "they may need a much larger correction later." Sproutlyn nodded thoughtfully. "That explains a great many things." From the dock came a burst of laughter. Sproutlyn looked toward the Black Orchid Café. A group of travellers had gathered outside now, leaning on the railing with cups of tea. Their conversation floated across the water like drifting feathers. Sproutlyn listened for a moment. "They're probably discussing life strategies." Mangolius smiled. "Quite likely." Sproutlyn looked back at the rudder. "So the ship needs the rudder?" Mangolius nodded. "Yes, and the garden needs pruning." "Yes." Sproutlyn pointed toward the amphitheatre in the distance. "And stories probably help people adjust their thinking." Mangolius's eyes sparkled. "You see the pattern," Sproutlyn grinned. "This harbour is very organised." Mangolius chuckled. "It has had time to evolve." The sun lowered slightly, casting long golden reflections across the water. Egabrag glowed softly in the warm light. Sproutlyn looked at the basil plant Mangolius had pruned. Already the remaining leaves seemed to stand straighter. "Plants don't get upset about pruning," she observed. Mangolius shook his head. "No, they simply grow better." Sproutlyn sighed. "Humans could learn from that." Mangolius laughed quietly. "Yes, they could." Sproutlyn looked at the rudder once more. "So the secret is paying attention to direction." Mangolius nodded. "And making gentle corrections." Sproutlyn smiled thoughtfully. "That feels much calmer than trying to fix everything at once." Mangolius looked out across the ocean. "Navigation favours calm minds." Sproutlyn followed his gaze. Far beyond the harbour entrance, the waters of the Ocean of Parc stretched endlessly into the fading sunlight. The surface looked peaceful, but she remembered what Mangolius had taught her earlier. Beneath the surface, currents moved, forces shifted, patterns formed. Sproutlyn leaned against the railing. "What happens when the ocean doesn't cooperate?" Mangolius smiled knowingly. "It eventually will not." Sproutlyn blinked. "That sounds ominous." Mangolius chuckled. "It is simply honest." Sproutlyn looked at the sky. Clouds were gathering slowly along the far horizon, nothing threatening yet, but noticeable. She squinted. "Is that a storm?" Mangolius followed her gaze. "Perhaps." Sproutlyn crossed her arms. "I was just beginning to feel confident about this navigation thing." Mangolius smiled warmly. "Good." Sproutlyn looked suspicious. "Why?" Mangolius tapped the deck gently with his staff. "Because confidence is about to meet weather." Sproutlyn sighed dramatically. "I suspected that might happen." The wind shifted again. The sails rustled softly. Somewhere far out on the ocean, a deeper swell rolled beneath the surface of Parc, a quiet reminder that calm seas do not last forever, and that sometimes the greatest lessons arrive riding on storms. Next will be one of the most important chapters in the story. Chapter 9. The Storm of Overthinking, where Sproutlyn learns that not every storm must be solved, some simply need to be ridden through. Chapter 9. The Storm of Overthinking. Evening had begun to gather quietly along the horizon of the Ocean of Parc. The sun, which had spent the entire day painting the harbour with patient strokes of gold and silver, now lowered itself toward the distant waterline as though preparing to tuck the day gently into sleep. From the terrace of the Black Orchid Cafe, the lanterns were being lit one by one. Soft amber light spilled onto the dock planks. The aroma of roasted roots, clove tea, and something sweet, possibly caramelized fig, drifted through the cooling air. Sproutlyn leaned against the railing of Egabrag, enjoying the peaceful rhythm of the harbour. The sails swayed softly, the garden leaves rustled. Tiny lanterns along the deck had been lit, glowing like fireflies, resting among the herbs. For a moment, everything felt perfectly balanced. Sproutlyn sighed contentedly. I could get used to this. Mangolius Draconium stood beside the mast, gazing thoughtfully toward the horizon. That, he said calmly, is often when the weather changes. Sproutlyn narrowed her eyes. I was hoping you might not say that. Mangolius pointed gently toward the distance. Sproutlyn followed his gaze. Along the far edge of the ocean, the sky had begun to gather darker shades of grey and deep blue. Clouds were forming, not dramatic yet, not violent, but thick enough to signal a shift. Sproutlyn squinted. That looks slightly concerning. Mangolius nodded. The ocean enjoys variety. The wind lifted gently. The sails rustled more noticeably now. Egabrag rocked a little more than before. Sproutlyn gripped the railing. Is this normal? Mangolius smiled. Very. Sproutlyn looked back at the horizon. The clouds were spreading slowly across the sky like ink drifting through water. What happens during a storm? She asked. Mangolius rested his hands on his staff. Many things, Sproutlyn frowned. That is not a comforting answer. Mangolius chuckled. The first thing that happens during a storm, he paused thoughtfully, is thinking. Sproutlyn blinked. Thinking? Mangolius nodded. Yes, lots of thinking. Sproutlyn tilted her head. That doesn't sound dangerous. Mangolius raised an eyebrow. Oh? The wind picked up again. The sails flapped once sharply. Egabrag shifted against its mooring rope. Sproutlyn watched the water. Small waves had begun forming, bumping gently against the hull. Storm thinking, Mangolius continued, usually sounds like this. He cleared his throat theatrically. What if the ship sinks? What if the sails tear? What if the rudder breaks? What if the map is wrong? Sproutlyn blinked. That escalated quickly. Mangolius nodded. Storms are excellent at that. The wind strengthened again. The garden leaves rustled loudly now. One of the lanterns swung gently on its hook. Sproutlyn crossed her arms. Well, those are legitimate concerns. Mangolius smiled. Yes, but they are not useful concerns. Sproutlyn frowned. What's the difference? Mangolius gestured toward the ocean. A larger swell rolled beneath the ship. Egabrag lifted slightly, then settled again. Storms create motion, he said. Sproutlyn nodded. Yes, storm thinking creates more motion. Sproutlyn blinked slowly. Oh, Mangolius leaned against the mast. When people encounter uncertainty, their minds begin trying to solve everything at once. Sproutlyn watched the clouds gathering above. That seems logical, Mangolius chuckled. It is also exhausting. The wind whistled softly through the rigging. A gull flew past quickly, clearly heading somewhere calmer. Sproutlyn gripped the railing again. So what should someone do during a storm? Mangolius gestured toward the sails. First, he walked to the ropes and loosened one slightly. The sail above lowered a little. Reduce pressure. Sproutlyn watched carefully. You're making the sails smaller. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn tilted her head. Why? Mangolius smiled. Because fighting the storm requires too much energy. The ship rocked again. The water around the harbour entrance had grown noticeably choppier. Sproutlyn glanced toward the cafe. The lanterns there glowed brighter now against the darkening sky. People inside continued their conversations calmly. Shouldn't everyone be panicking? She asked. Mangolius laughed softly. No. Why not? Because this is Parc. Sproutlyn blinked. That sounds mysterious. Mangolius gestured toward the harbour. Storms come and go here, Sproutlyn nodded slowly. So people are used to them, Mangolius smiled. And they know something important. Sproutlyn leaned closer. What? Mangolius looked out at the ocean. You do not defeat a storm by thinking harder. Sproutlyn paused. That seems like useful advice. The wind strengthened again. The sails flapped sharply before settling into a tighter shape. Mangolius tied one of the ropes securely. Sproutlyn watched him. So what do navigators actually do? Mangolius counted gently on his fingers. They stabilize the ship. He pointed to the garden beds. They secure loose things. He gestured toward the sails. They reduce pressure. Sproutlyn nodded. That seems practical. Mangolius leaned against the railing again. And then, Sproutlyn waited, they ride the storm. Sproutlyn blinked. That's it. Mangolius smiled. That is usually enough. The first drops of rain began to fall. Not heavy, just soft tapping sounds across the deck. Sproutlyn looked up. Clouds now covered most of the sky. The harbour lights glowed warmly through the mist. Sproutlyn thought for a moment. So storms are not something you solve? Mangolius nodded. Correct. They are something you survive. Sproutlyn looked at the waves. The water moved faster now, swirling with restless energy. She took a deep breath. That makes storms sound less like enemies. Mangolius smiled. They are teachers. Sproutlyn looked skeptical. What do they teach? Mangolius tapped the railing gently. Calm. Sproutlyn blinked. Calm? Mangolius nodded. Yes. The storm moves fast. The ocean moves strong. But the navigator? He placed his hand on the helm. Moves slowly. Sproutlyn watched the wheel. Mangolius adjusted it just slightly. The rudder responded. The ship shifted gently. A small correction. Sproutlyn smiled. The rudder again. Mangolius nodded. Always the rudder. Rain began falling a little more steadily now. The ocean surface shimmered under the lantern light. Sproutlyn wiped a raindrop from her leaf. This storm isn't actually very scary, Mangolius chuckled. Not all storms are. Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. But the thinking part could be. Mangolius smiled warmly. Exactly. She looked out across the darkening waters of Parc. The clouds rolled overhead, the wind hummed through the sails, but the ship remained steady, and inside the harbour the warm glow of the Black Orchid Café still flickered like a small lighthouse of conversation and comfort. Sproutlyn leaned on the railing and watched the rain fall across the ocean. I think I understand something now, she said quietly. Mangolius waited. Storms outside the ship are manageable. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn looked at the swirling water. But storms inside the mind, Mangolius finished her thought gently, are the ones that sink people. Sproutlyn nodded slowly. That seems important. Mangolius looked toward the horizon. The rain was already beginning to soften. Storms rarely lasted forever on Parc. Fortunately, he said calmly, the ocean always settles. Sproutlyn smiled. I like that. Mangolius tapped his staff lightly on the deck. And when it does... Sproutlyn tilted her head. What then? Mangolius looked toward the garden beds. Then we learn about balance. Sproutlyn followed his gaze. The soil bed sat steady despite the rocking ship. She squinted thoughtfully. Is this another gardening metaphor? Mangolius chuckled. Always. Next comes a grounding and important chapter. Chapter 10. The soil of stability, where Sproutlyn learns how ballast in ships and soil in gardens both create balance and resilience. Chapter 10. The soil of stability. The rain did not last long. Storms on the Ocean of Parc often behaved like passionate debates, intense for a moment, then suddenly quiet, as though the sky itself had decided that it had said enough for one evening. By the time the clouds drifted apart again, the harbour had transformed. The lanterns along the dock glowed brighter against the deepening twilight. Reflections danced across the wet wooden planks like long golden ribbons stretching across the water. From the open windows of the Black Orchid Café, warm light spilled outward, along with the gentle hum of evening conversation. Somewhere inside, cups were clinking softly. Someone laughed. Someone else was explaining something with dramatic enthusiasm. The world had resumed its comfortable rhythm. Sproutlyn leaned against the railing of Egabrag, watching the last droplets of rain slide down the ship's mast. The garden beds glistened beautifully. Each leaf held tiny beads of water that shimmered like jewels in the lantern light. She crouched beside the nearest planter and pressed her finger gently into the soil. The earth was dark, cool, and perfectly firm. She smiled. That storm barely disturbed the garden. Mangolius Draconium stood nearby adjusting one of the deck lanterns. That, he said calmly, is because of the soil. Sproutlyn looked up. The soil? Mangolius nodded. Yes. He walked toward the center of the deck and gently tapped one of the wooden planter boxes with his staff. The soil inside did not shift, it held steady. Good soil, he said, anchors the roots. Sproutlyn nodded slowly. That makes sense. Mangolius then walked to the stern of the ship and gestured downward toward the hull. Ships have something similar. Sproutlyn leaned over the railing. The rudder? Mangolius shook his head. No, something deeper. Sproutlyn squinted at the water. The anchor, Mangolius smiled. Closer. He tapped the wooden deck beneath their feet. The ballast! Sproutlyn blinked. Ballast, Mangolius nodded. Weight stored deep within the ship's hull. Sproutlyn tilted her head. Why would someone put extra weight in a ship? Mangolius chuckled. To prevent it from tipping over. Sproutlyn looked surprised. That seems extremely important. Mangolius nodded. It is. He walked back toward the garden beds. A ship without ballast is unstable. Sproutlyn imagined the ship rocking wildly. That sounds unpleasant, Mangolius nodded. Even a small wave could overturn it. Sproutlyn crossed her arms thoughtfully. So ballast stabilizes the ship. Mangolius pointed toward the soil. Just like soil stabilizes plants. Sproutlyn looked down at the roots hidden beneath the earth. So roots need something firm to hold on to. Mangolius nodded. Yes, and ships need something heavy to balance them. Yes. Sproutlyn leaned back against the planter box. So stability requires weight. Mangolius smiled. Correct. Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. That's interesting. Mangolius waited. In life, she continued slowly, people often try to get rid of everything heavy. Mangolius raised an eyebrow. Oh, Sproutlyn nodded. They try to avoid responsibility. They avoid commitment. They avoid structure. Mangolius chuckled softly. And what happens then? Sproutlyn pointed toward the ship. They become unstable. Mangolius smiled broadly. Exactly. The breeze returned gently now, carrying the clean scent of rain across the harbor. The sails rustled quietly above them. Sproutlyn walked slowly around the garden beds. She noticed something new. Small stones had been mixed carefully into the soil. Bits of bark, sand, tiny fragments of shell. Why are there so many different things in the soil? She asked. Mangolius leaned on his staff. Healthy soil is diverse. Sproutlyn nodded thoughtfully. So everything contributes to stability. Mangolius smiled. Yes, too much of one thing creates imbalance. Sproutlyn looked toward the harbor. The lights of the Black Orchid Cafe reflected warmly on the water. Voices drifted across the dock, some calm, some animated, some thoughtful. She smiled. That cafe probably stabilizes people. Mangolius chuckled. In its own way. Sproutlyn looked toward the amphitheater of echoing wisdom beyond the cafe. The stone bowl now glowed softly under hanging lanterns. A storyteller's voice echoed faintly through the evening air, and the amphitheater stabilizes ideas. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn returned to the railing and gazed out across the Ocean of Parc. The storm clouds had moved far away now. The water had settled into gentle rolling swells once more. Storms don't seem as frightening when the ship is balanced, she said. Mangolius rested his staff against the deck. That is the purpose of ballast, Sproutlyn smiled. And soil! Mangolius nodded. And soil! She thought quietly for a moment. Then she asked something softly. What is ballast in a person's life? Mangolius looked out across the water. His voice grew thoughtful. Routine, values, commitments, relationships, purpose. Sproutlyn nodded slowly. All the things that keep someone from drifting. Mangolius smiled warmly. Yes. Sproutlyn looked at the garden again. The plants stood tall despite the earlier wind. Their roots held firmly in the rich, dark soil. That means stability is not about avoiding storms, she said. Mangolius nodded. No, it is about being prepared for them. Sproutlyn leaned against the railing and watched the stars beginning to appear above the harbor. The sky of Parc was clearing beautifully now. One by one, the stars revealed themselves like lanterns being lit across the heavens. Everything seems calm again, she said. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn smiled. I like calm. Mangolius chuckled softly. Enjoy it while it lasts. Sproutlyn narrowed her eyes suspiciously. That sounds like the beginning of another lesson. Mangolius pointed gently toward the sails. The wind had faded almost completely. The canvas hung quietly now. Still, heavy, unmoving. Sproutlyn blinked. That's unusual. Mangolius nodded. Yes! Sproutlyn looked out toward the ocean. The water had become almost mirror-like in its stillness. Even the smallest ripples had disappeared. The harbour seemed to be holding its breath. Sproutlyn frowned. Why did the wind stop? Mangolius smiled knowingly. Because now. He tapped the deck lightly with his staff. We learn about patience. Sproutlyn blinked. Oh no, Mangolius chuckled. Yes, Sproutlyn sighed dramatically. This sounds like a lesson about waiting. Mangolius nodded. Very much so. Next comes a very reflective Chapter 11. The Wind That Would Not Blow, where Sproutlyn discovers that sometimes progress stops entirely, and that stillness has its own lessons. Chapter 11. The Wind That Would Not Blow. Night settled over the dock of listening with the quiet grace of a curtain falling at the end of a play. The lanterns along the harbour glowed softly, casting warm halos of light across the still water of the Ocean of Parc. The reflections stretched and trembled gently, like golden brushstrokes drifting over a dark canvas. But something had changed. The wind had disappeared, not weakened, not shifted, simply gone. The sails of Egabrag hung quietly against the mast, their once lively movement replaced by a deep, unmoving stillness. Sproutlyn stood beneath them, arms crossed, looking upward with growing suspicion. "Well," she said after a moment, "this seems inconvenient." Mangolius Draconium leaned comfortably against the railing, his staff resting lightly in one hand. "Yes!" Sproutlyn squinted at the sails again. "They're not doing anything." Mangolius nodded. "No!" Sproutlyn looked toward the ocean. The surface of Parc had become astonishingly calm. The waves had smoothed into long, gentle swells that moved so slowly they almost appeared frozen in time. Even the gulls had settled onto the harbour posts, as though waiting patiently for the air to remember how to move. Sproutlyn sighed. So the wind just stopped. Mangolius smiled. Sometimes it does. Sproutlyn leaned against the mast. But we just learned how sails work. Mangolius nodded. "Yes!" Sproutlyn gestured upward. "And now they don't." Mangolius chuckled. "That is also part of navigation." Sproutlyn frowned thoughtfully. "That seems unfair." Mangolius raised an eyebrow. "Oh!" Sproutlyn nodded. "We just learned how to catch the wind." Mangolius smiled. "And now you will learn what happens when there is none." Sproutlyn looked toward the horizon. The night sky stretched wide above the ocean, sprinkled with stars that shimmered like distant lanterns hung across the universe. "Do ships just sit here when the wind disappears?" she asked. Mangolius nodded calmly. "Sometimes." Sproutlyn blinked. "For how long?" Mangolius looked thoughtfully at the sky. "Hours." Sproutlyn frowned. "That's tolerable." Mangolius continued. "Sometimes days." Sproutlyn's eyes widened. "Days?" Mangolius nodded. "Occasionally longer." Sproutlyn stared at him in disbelief. "That seems extremely inefficient." Mangolius chuckled. "The ocean is not concerned with efficiency." Sproutlyn leaned over the railing, peering at the water. The surface reflected the stars so perfectly it looked as though the ship were floating between two skies. "Well," she said, "this is beautiful." Mangolius nodded. "Yes," Sproutlyn sighed, "but beauty is not movement." Mangolius smiled knowingly. "No," Sproutlyn turned to face him. "So what does a navigator do when nothing is happening?" Mangolius gestured toward the garden beds. "Observe." Sproutlyn looked confused. "Observe what?" Mangolius pointed toward the soil. "The plants." Sproutlyn walked slowly to the garden. The herbs stood quietly in the lantern light. No wind moved their leaves. No rain touched the soil. Everything appeared completely still. She crouched beside the basil plant Mangolius had pruned earlier. The leaves looked stronger now. Healthier. She blinked. "Wait!" Mangolius watched her. "Yes." Sproutlyn leaned closer. "It grew." Mangolius nodded. "Yes." Sproutlyn looked amazed. But nothing was happening. Mangolius smiled gently. "Growth often looks like stillness." Sproutlyn stared at the plant. The change was small, but undeniable. A new leaf had unfurled slightly since earlier. "How did that happen without wind or rain?" she asked. Mangolius leaned on his staff. "Because life continues even when motion stops." Sproutlyn nodded slowly. "So stillness is not the same as stagnation." Mangolius smiled. "Very good." Sproutlyn sat beside the garden bed and looked out over the quiet ocean. "So sometimes progress is invisible." Mangolius nodded. "Yes." Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. "I think people panic during stillness." Mangolius chuckled. "Frequently." Sproutlyn nodded. They think something is wrong. Mangolius smiled. Exactly. She leaned back against the planter box. But sometimes nothing is wrong. Mangolius gestured toward the ocean. Sometimes the wind is simply gathering itself. Sproutlyn looked at the sails. They hung quietly in the night air, waiting, patient, like giant folded wings. That must require trust, she said softly. Mangolius nodded. Yes, trust in the wind. Sproutlyn looked back at the ocean. And trust in the journey. Mangolius smiled warmly. Exactly. The harbour had grown quiet now. From the Black Orchid Café, soft music drifted into the night air. Someone inside was playing a slow piano melody that felt like moonlight translated into sound. Sproutlyn listened carefully. That café is very calming. Mangolius nodded. It has had many years to practice. Sproutlyn glanced toward the amphitheatre of echoing wisdom. The lanterns there had been dimmed now, though a few travellers still lingered on the stone steps, sharing quiet conversations beneath the stars. It seems like everything rests at night, she observed. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. So rest is part of the system, too. Mangolius smiled. An essential part. Sproutlyn leaned on the railing and watched the reflection of the stars on the water. The ocean felt enormous now. Endless. Silent, yet somehow comforting. She took a slow breath. I think I like this stillness. Mangolius chuckled softly. That is an excellent skill. Sproutlyn glanced at him. Why? Mangolius pointed toward the dark horizon. Because stillness often comes before discovery. Sproutlyn squinted into the night. Discovery? Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn frowned. That sounds suspicious. Mangolius smiled. Curiosity often does. Sproutlyn looked out over the water again. The ocean remained perfectly calm. The sails hung quietly. The garden rested peacefully beneath the lantern light. Everything seemed balanced, stable, quiet, but far out near the horizon, something faint shimmered beneath the surface of the water. Sproutlyn narrowed her eyes. Did you see that? Mangolius followed her gaze. Yes. Sproutlyn leaned forward slightly. What is it? Mangolius rested both hands on his staff. A reminder. Sproutlyn blinked. Of what? Mangolius smiled knowingly. That the ocean is never as simple as it appears. Sproutlyn stared into the darkness, curiosity stirring once more. Is this another lesson? Mangolius nodded gently. Yes. Sproutlyn sighed with theatrical resignation. Of course it is. Mangolius chuckled. Tomorrow, he said calmly, we discuss distractions. Sproutlyn groaned. That sounds dangerous. Mangolius smiled. It can be. Next comes a fascinating chapter. Chapter 12, The Reef of Distraction, where Sproutlyn discovers that the most dangerous obstacles in life are often the ones that look the most appealing. Chapter 12, The Reef of Distraction. Dawn arrived quietly over the Ocean of Parc, like a whisper brushing gently across the surface of a sleeping mind. At first the sky only hinted at light, a soft silver glow rising slowly from beneath the horizon. Then the colour deepened into pale lavender and finally into warm amber as the sun stretched its first golden fingers across the sea. The wind had returned. Not dramatically. Just enough to stir the sails of Egabrag with a quiet woof, rustle, woof, like a giant creature slowly remembering how to breathe. Sproutlyn stood near the bow, watching the light spread across the water. The ocean sparkled with morning brightness, each ripple catching sunlight like a scattered field of tiny mirrors. She stretched her leafy arms. That was an excellent night of doing absolutely nothing. Mangolius Draconium chuckled softly behind her. Stillness often prepares the mind, Sproutlyn nodded thoughtfully. I do feel more organized. Mangolius leaned on the railing. Good. Sproutlyn looked out toward the open sea. So what was that shimmering thing you pointed out last night? Mangolius followed her gaze. The water beyond the harbour had begun to glow with bright turquoise patches beneath the surface. At first they looked beautiful, almost magical, like underwater gardens illuminated by hidden lanterns. Sproutlyn leaned forward excitedly. Oh! Mangolius raised an eyebrow. Yes, that's gorgeous! Mangolius nodded. Yes, Sproutlyn pointed eagerly. Can we sail there? Mangolius smiled slightly. That, he said calmly, is the Reef of Distraction. Sproutlyn blinked. That seems like a rather judgmental name. Mangolius chuckled. It earned the title. Sproutlyn looked again. The reef shimmered brilliantly beneath the shallow water. Bright coral shapes glowed with colours that seemed almost impossible. deep oranges, radiant blues, and delicate pinks that danced in the sunlight. Schools of small fish flashed like living jewels between the coral branches. Sproutlyn leaned further over the railing. "That looks delightful." Mangolius nodded. "It often does." Sproutlyn glanced back at him. "But," Mangolius gestured toward the water, "those coral structures sit just beneath the surface." Sproutlyn squinted. "Oh!" Mangolius continued. "A ship that sails over them." Sproutlyn winced, would quickly discover a new hole in its hull. Sproutlyn leaned back from the railing. "That is considerably less delightful." Mangolius smiled. "Exactly." Sproutlyn studied the reef carefully now. From this angle, she could see how deceptively shallow the water had become. The beautiful coral formations were hidden just below the surface, sharp and unforgiving. "That's tricky," she said. Mangolius nodded. "Very." Sproutlyn folded her arms thoughtfully. "So distractions look appealing." Mangolius smiled. "Yes, but high danger." Mangolius nodded. "Often." Sproutlyn looked back toward the reef. The colors shimmered hypnotically beneath the clear water. "I can see how someone might sail right toward that," Mangolius chuckled. "Many have." Sproutlyn looked surprised. "Really?" Mangolius pointed toward the map table. "Come." They walked back across the deck. Mangolius unrolled the large parchment map of Parc once more. He pointed to a small cluster of symbols drawn along the edge of the harbor entrance. Tiny jagged lines marked the reef's position. Beside them was written a small note in careful script. "Beautiful but unwise." Sproutlyn laughed. "That's a very honest warning." Mangolius nodded. "Experience tends to be." Sproutlyn looked at the reef again. "So navigators learn to recognize distractions." Mangolius nodded. "Yes." Sproutlyn tilted her head. "How?" Mangolius tapped the map. "By studying patterns." Sproutlyn thought for a moment. "Because reefs appear where shallow water meets strong current." Mangolius smiled. "Well reasoned." Sproutlyn grinned. "I am becoming quite skilled at this." Mangolius chuckled. "You are." Sproutlyn leaned on the railing again and watched the reef carefully. "So distractions are not always bad." Mangolius raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Sproutlyn nodded. "That coral reef is actually very beautiful." Mangolius smiled. "Yes," Sproutlyn continued, "and probably full of life." Mangolius nodded. "Very much so." Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. "So the problem is not beauty." Mangolius nodded. "No, the problem is forgetting where you're going." Sproutlyn smiled slowly. "That makes sense." The breeze strengthened slightly, filling the sails with a gentle push. Egabrag shifted smoothly against the dock lines. Sproutlyn watched the reef one last time. "It would be nice to visit there someday." Mangolius nodded. "With a smaller boat." Sproutlyn laughed. "That seems wise." Mangolius looked out across the open ocean. "The navigator's challenge is not avoiding all interesting things." Sproutlyn tilted her head. "Then what is it?" Mangolius rested his hands on his staff, "knowing when something belongs to your journey." Sproutlyn nodded slowly. "And when it doesn't?" Mangolius smiled. "Exactly." From the dock behind them came the cheerful sound of morning activity. The doors of the Black Orchid Cafe had opened again. The smell of roasted beans and warm bread drifted across the harbor. Sproutlyn inhaled deeply. "That cafe is the opposite of a reef," Mangolius chuckled. "How so?" Sproutlyn smiled. "It helps people stay on course." Mangolius nodded. "Indeed it does." Sproutlyn turned her gaze back toward the open ocean. The reef sparkled behind them now. "Beautiful, tempting, but safely avoided." She smiled with quiet satisfaction. "I think I'm getting the hang of navigation." Mangolius looked pleased. "You are." Sproutlyn leaned on the railing, watching the morning sun rise higher. "So what comes next?" Mangolius pointed toward the far edge of the harbor. In the distance, a tall, slender tower rose from a small rocky island. Its glass lantern dome glowed faintly in the morning light. Sproutlyn squinted. "A lighthouse." Mangolius nodded. "Yes," Sproutlyn smiled. "That sounds helpful." Mangolius chuckled. "Extremely." Sproutlyn stretched again. "Well then," she turned eagerly toward the horizon. "Let's learn about that." Mangolius nodded thoughtfully. "Today," he said gently, "we learn about listening." Sproutlyn blinked. "I thought lighthouses were for looking." Mangolius smiled. "That too." "Next comes a beautiful reflective chapter. Chapter 13. The Lighthouse of Listening, where Sproutlyn learns that guidance often arrives quietly, and only those who slow down can recognize it. Chapter 13. The Lighthouse of Listening. Morning had now fully unfolded across the Ocean of Parc, and the harbour glowed with the gentle brightness of a world waking slowly and thoughtfully. The breeze had returned just enough to keep the sails of Egabrag alive with quiet movement. Not strong, not demanding, just steady enough to remind the ship that the world was still in motion. Sproutlyn stood at the bow, watching the small rocky island ahead. Upon it stood the lighthouse. From a distance it appeared simple, a tall stone tower rising from the rock like a single thoughtful finger pointing toward the sky. But as the morning light strengthened, details began to appear. Weathered stone blocks fitted carefully together, small windows spiraling upward like a staircase carved into the tower itself. At the top, beneath a glass dome, the great lantern waited patiently. Even in daylight, it seemed to hold a quiet authority. Sproutlyn squinted thoughtfully. "It looks very calm." Mangolius Draconium stood beside the mast, observing the tower with the quiet familiarity of someone who had seen it many times before. "Yes," he said, "that is its purpose." Sproutlyn turned toward him. "To look important?" Mangolius chuckled. "No, to remain steady." Sproutlyn leaned against the railing again. "That seems simple." Mangolius nodded. "It is." The ship drifted gently closer to the island. The water around the lighthouse was deeper here, swirling slowly with currents that had learned to respect the rocky shore. Sproutlyn watched the tower carefully. "So the lighthouse tells ships where the land is?" Mangolius nodded. "Yes, and where the rocks are." "Yes," Sproutlyn thought for a moment. "That sounds like a very useful job." Mangolius smiled. "Extremely." Sproutlyn tilted her head. "But the lighthouse doesn't shout." Mangolius nodded. "No, it just shines." Mangolius smiled warmly. "Yes!" Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. "So navigators have to notice it." Mangolius leaned on his staff. "Exactly." Sproutlyn watched the tower again. The lantern inside the glass dome caught the sunlight now, scattering small flashes of brilliance across the water. "It's quiet," she said. Mangolius nodded. "Guidance often is." Sproutlyn crossed her arms. "That seems slightly inconvenient." Mangolius chuckled. "Why?" Sproutlyn shrugged. "Because people usually expect guidance to be obvious." Mangolius smiled knowingly. "Yes, but wisdom rarely shouts." Sproutlyn looked out across the water. "Storms shout," Mangolius nodded. "Very loudly." Sproutlyn pointed toward the lighthouse. "But guidance whispers." Mangolius smiled. "Exactly." The ship drifted slowly past the rocky island. From this distance, Sproutlyn could see a small wooden door near the base of the tower. A narrow path wound upward along the rocks. She imagined someone living there, climbing the tower every evening, lighting the great lantern, watching the ocean in quiet patience. "That must be a lonely job," she said. Mangolius shook his head gently. "No." Sproutlyn blinked. "It isn't." Mangolius gestured toward the sea. "The lighthouse keeper watches every ship that passes." Sproutlyn nodded slowly. "So they're connected to everyone." Mangolius smiled. "Yes, through listening." Sproutlyn leaned forward thoughtfully. "I think I understand something." Mangolius waited. "The lighthouse doesn't chase ships." Mangolius nodded. "No, it just stays where it is." "Yes," Sproutlyn smiled, "and ships find it when they need it." Mangolius rested his staff lightly on the deck. "Very good." The breeze shifted slightly. The sails caught it gently. Egabrag turned a little farther toward the open ocean. Sproutlyn watched the lighthouse grow smaller behind them. "It reminds me of the cafe." Mangolius raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Sproutlyn nodded. "The Black Orchid Cafe doesn't chase people either." Mangolius chuckled. "No, but people find it when they need conversation." Mangolius smiled. "Yes," Sproutlyn continued, thinking aloud. "And the amphitheater doesn't chase stories." Mangolius nodded. "No, but people bring them there." Sproutlyn looked pleased. "So the harbour is full of lighthouses." Mangolius chuckled. "That is a beautiful way to describe it." Sproutlyn leaned on the railing again. The lighthouse now stood quietly behind them, its white stone glowing in the morning sun. She felt a strange calm settle inside her thoughts. "So if someone learns to listen," Mangolius nodded, "they will recognize guidance?" Sproutlyn smiled. "Even when it's quiet." Mangolius nodded again. "Yes." The ocean stretched endlessly ahead now. The harbour was fading behind them. The open waters of Parc awaited. Sproutlyn took a slow breath. "I feel like the journey is really beginning." Mangolius smiled warmly. "It is." Sproutlyn watched the horizon carefully. "What happens next?" Mangolius pointed toward the distant shoreline. Far beyond the lighthouse, the land curved into a wide natural bowl of stone. Even from this distance, the curved terraces were visible, the amphitheatre of echoing wisdom. But something was different today. The amphitheatre was full. Lantern banners hung from the upper walls. Voices echoed faintly across the water. Sproutlyn blinked. "That looks busy." Mangolius nodded. "Yes." Sproutlyn tilted her head. "What's happening there?" Mangolius smiled. "A gathering." Sproutlyn brightened instantly. "Oh, good." She turned toward the shore eagerly. "I like gatherings." Mangolius chuckled. "You will enjoy this one." Sproutlyn narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "Is it another lesson?" Mangolius rested both hands on his staff. "Always." Sproutlyn sighed dramatically. "I suspected as much." Next comes a lively and important chapter. Chapter 14, The Amphitheatre Gathering, where Sproutlyn sees how shared wisdom multiplies when many voices contribute to understanding. Chapter 14, The Amphitheatre Gathering. By the time Egabrag drifted back toward the harbour shoreline, the day had grown bright and alive with activity. The dock of listening hummed with a deeper rhythm than usual. Lantern banners had been hung along the wooden posts, their fabrics painted in colours that mirrored the sea itself, deep cobalt, coral orange, and pale turquoise that shimmered in the morning light. From the terrace of the Black Orchid Café, tables had been pushed outward onto the dock. Travellers stood in clusters, cups of tea in their hands, engaged in animated discussions that seemed to grow larger with every passing minute. Sproutlyn leaned eagerly over the railing of Egabrag. "What is happening today?" Mangolius Draconium rested comfortably beside the mast, watching the harbour with a calm expression. "It is a gathering day." Sproutlyn blinked. "Does that mean everyone gathers?" Mangolius chuckled. "More or less." They stepped down the gangplank and joined the slow flow of travellers moving toward the amphitheatre of echoing wisdom. Sproutlyn noticed something immediately. The harbour felt different, more energetic, more curious. People were carrying things, scrolls, maps, notebooks, even small wooden boxes filled with curious objects. One traveller held what looked suspiciously like a miniature windmill. Another carried a jar of glowing blue seeds. Sproutlyn looked delighted. "This is the most interesting crowd I have ever seen." Mangolius nodded. "Yes." They reached the amphitheatre steps. The stone bowl was full. Every row held listeners leaning forward with anticipation. The stage at the centre had been decorated with simple wooden stands where travellers could place objects or scrolls while speaking. Sproutlyn whispered to Mangolius. "What are they doing?" Mangolius smiled. "They are sharing discoveries." Sproutlyn's eyes widened. "Oh, good." The first speaker stepped onto the stage. He was a tall sailor with sun-browned skin and a hat that appeared to have survived several enthusiastic storms. He placed a small compass on the wooden stand beside him. "This compass," he began, "saved my ship during the fogs of the Northern Passage." Sproutlyn leaned forward. "I like him already." The sailor continued. "I once believed navigation was about courage." A ripple of laughter moved through the amphitheatre. "But courage alone is not enough." He lifted the compass. "Courage without direction simply sails faster toward trouble." The crowd chuckled warmly. Sproutlyn nodded approvingly. "That sounds accurate." Mangolius smiled. The sailor stepped aside as the next traveller approached. This one was a gardener. She carried a small wooden box filled with dark soil. She placed it gently on the stand. "This soil," she said, "came from the eastern cliffs where the wind never stops." Sproutlyn leaned closer. "How does anything grow there?" The gardener smiled. "Because the soil is rich with broken stone." She lifted a handful of earth. "Sometimes what breaks us becomes what feeds us." The amphitheatre grew quiet. Sproutlyn blinked slowly. "That was unexpectedly profound." Mangolius nodded. "Gatherings often are." The next speaker was a young traveller holding a map covered in notes. He spread it across the stand. "I have spent 3 years charting hidden currents along the western shelf." Sproutlyn squinted. "That sounds complicated." Mangolius chuckled. "Most discoveries are." The traveller pointed to faint swirling lines drawn across the map. "These currents appear random," he explained, "but they actually follow a repeating cycle." Sproutlyn leaned toward Mangolius. "Everything here seems to involve patterns." Mangolius nodded. "Indeed." The amphitheatre buzzed with quiet excitement as each speaker shared something new. Some discoveries were practical, better sail designs, safer routes through dangerous waters. Others were philosophical, stories of storms survived, lessons learned from unexpected failures. One musician even demonstrated how certain songs could help sailors maintain steady rowing rhythm during long, calm winds. Sproutlyn clapped enthusiastically. "That is extremely useful." Mangolius chuckled. As the gathering continued, Sproutlyn noticed something remarkable. Each speaker added something new, a new idea, a new experience, a new pattern. But instead of contradicting one another, the ideas seemed to fit together, like pieces of a puzzle, slowly revealing a larger picture. She leaned toward Mangolius. "I think something important is happening." Mangolius smiled. "Yes." Sproutlyn gestured toward the stage. "One person shares an idea." Mangolius nodded. "Yes." "Then another person adds something." "Yes, and the idea becomes bigger." Mangolius leaned on his staff. "Exactly." Sproutlyn watched the crowd carefully. Everyone listened, not just politely, but actively. Heads nodded, notes were written, new questions formed. "This is like the cafe," she said. Mangolius raised an eyebrow. "Oh," Sproutlyn nodded. "Except louder." Mangolius laughed. "True," Sproutlyn continued. "The cafe plants ideas." Mangolius nodded. "Yes, the amphitheatre grows them." Mangolius smiled warmly. "Well said!" The final speaker stepped onto the stage as the sun climbed higher in the sky. This traveller was older. His beard was white and long, and his coat carried the weathered look of someone who had spent many years walking unfamiliar roads. He placed nothing on the stand. Instead, he simply looked around the amphitheatre. "I have travelled across many harbours," he said calmly, "but few places understand something this important." The crowd leaned forward. The old traveller continued. "Wisdom grows best when it is shared." Sproutlyn nodded slowly. "That makes sense." The traveller spread his hands toward the gathered crowd. "No single navigator knows everything. No single gardener grows every plant. No single thinker understands the entire ocean." He paused, but together, his voice echoed beautifully along the curved stone walls, "we map the world." The amphitheatre erupted in applause. Sproutlyn clapped with great enthusiasm. "That was excellent." Mangolius smiled. "Yes." The crowd began to disperse slowly, travellers continuing their conversations as they moved back toward the harbour. Sproutlyn remained seated for a moment, absorbing everything she had heard. "I feel like my mind just grew 3 new branches," she said. Mangolius chuckled. "That is a good sign." Sproutlyn stood and stretched. "So gatherings help people learn faster." Mangolius nodded. "Yes." Sproutlyn glanced toward the Black Orchid Cafe. More travellers were heading there now, clearly eager to continue their discussions. "That cafe is about to become very busy." Mangolius smiled knowingly. "Yes." Sproutlyn turned toward the ocean again. The water sparkled brilliantly beneath the midday sun. The sails of Egabrag rustled softly in the breeze. "So what comes next?" she asked. Mangolius gestured toward the cafe. "Conversation." Sproutlyn grinned. "I like conversation." Mangolius chuckled. "Good." Sproutlyn tilted her head thoughtfully. "Because I have many questions." Mangolius smiled. "That," he said gently, "is how journeys deepen." Next comes a thoughtful and lively chapter. Chapter 15, The Black Orchid Conversations, where Sproutlyn learns how questions can be more powerful than answers. Chapter 15, The Black Orchid Conversations. By the time Sproutlyn and Mangolius returned to the dock of listening, the harbour had become wonderfully alive with discussion. The gathering at the Amphitheatre of Echoing Wisdom had released its travellers like a burst of seeds carried on a warm wind. Everywhere along the dock, small circles of conversation had formed. Maps were being unfolded. Ideas were being debated. Someone was sketching sail designs on the back of a cafe napkin with surprising seriousness. And at the centre of it all stood the warm, lantern-lit doorway of the Black Orchid Cafe. Sproutlyn inhaled deeply as they approached. "That place smells like curiosity." Mangolius chuckled. "That is an accurate description." Inside, the cafe was buzzing with thoughtful energy. Tables that had been quiet earlier were now alive with discussion. Cups of tea steamed gently while notebooks filled with fresh ideas spread across the wooden surfaces. The shelves of strange objects seemed to glow with new significance. Compasses, seeds, weathered journals. Each item now looked less like decoration and more like evidence of journeys that had already begun. Sproutlyn and Mangolius found a small table near the tall window overlooking the harbour. Through the glass, the sails of Egabrag could be seen moving softly in the breeze. Sproutlyn settled into her chair with the satisfied expression of someone preparing to think very hard about something very interesting. A server arrived almost immediately with 2 cups of tea, one large, one small. Sproutlyn smiled. "They know us already." Mangolius nodded. "Regular visitors tend to be remembered." Sproutlyn took a careful sip. Warm spice and honey filled her senses. She sighed happily. "Thinking tea," Mangolius smiled. "That is its reputation." Around them the cafe hummed with lively discussion. At the next table, 2 navigators debated the best way to read distant cloud patterns. Near the far wall, a group of gardeners discussed soil composition with intense enthusiasm. Sproutlyn listened carefully. Then she turned to Mangolius. "I have a question." Mangolius nodded. "Yes?" Sproutlyn tilted her head. "How do people discover new things?" Mangolius raised an eyebrow. "Many ways." Sproutlyn waited. Mangolius smiled. "But most discoveries begin with questions." Sproutlyn nodded thoughtfully. "That seems logical." Mangolius leaned forward slightly. "Tell me something." Sproutlyn blinked. "Yes? What is the most powerful tool a navigator has?" Sproutlyn considered carefully. "The compass?" Mangolius shook his head. "The map?" Mangolius smiled. "Helpful, but not the most powerful." Sproutlyn frowned thoughtfully. "The sails?" Mangolius chuckled. "No," Sproutlyn sighed. "I suspect this is a trick question." Mangolius leaned back in his chair. "The most powerful tool a navigator has," he paused, "is curiosity." Sproutlyn blinked. "Curiosity," Mangolius nodded. "Yes," Sproutlyn leaned forward eagerly. "That explains this cafe." Mangolius smiled. "Yes." Sproutlyn gestured around the room. "Everyone here is asking questions." Mangolius nodded. "Exactly." Sproutlyn watched the conversations unfolding around them. Each group seemed to be exploring something, testing ideas, building understanding. "No one here seems worried about being wrong," she observed. Mangolius chuckled. "That is another secret." Sproutlyn tilted her head. "What?" Mangolius smiled. "Good questions are more valuable than quick answers." Sproutlyn thought about that. "So questions open door," Mangolius nodded. "Yes." Sproutlyn pointed toward the harbour. "And answers close them." Mangolius smiled. "Sometimes." Sproutlyn leaned back thoughtfully. "That's interesting." Mangolius took a sip of tea. "Curiosity keeps journeys alive." Sproutlyn nodded slowly. "So the moment someone stops asking questions," Mangolius finished her thought gently, "their map stops growing." Sproutlyn smiled. "That explains why the amphitheatre gathering was so exciting." Mangolius nodded. "Shared curiosity multiplies discovery." Sproutlyn looked out the window again. The harbour sparkled beneath the midday sun. Small boats moved slowly along the water like wandering thoughts. "I think curiosity is a kind of wind," she said. Mangolius raised an eyebrow. "Oh," Sproutlyn nodded, "it pushes people forward." Mangolius chuckled softly. "That is a beautiful metaphor." Sproutlyn smiled proudly. "I am learning." At that moment, a traveller from the next table leaned toward them. "Excuse me," he said kindly. "I couldn't help overhearing your discussion." Sproutlyn brightened immediately. "That happens a lot in cafes." The traveller smiled. "I have a question of my own." Sproutlyn leaned forward eagerly. "Oh, good." The traveller unfolded a small notebook. "Why do some people sail far beyond the harbour while others never leave?" Sproutlyn blinked. "That's a good question." Mangolius nodded. "Yes." The traveller waited. Sproutlyn thought carefully. Then she smiled. "Because some people are curious about the horizon." Mangolius chuckled. "And some are comfortable with the dock." The traveller nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense." He closed his notebook with satisfaction. "Thank you." He returned to his table, clearly pleased with the conversation. Sproutlyn leaned back in her chair. "I like this place." Mangolius smiled. "It likes you too." Sproutlyn glanced around the cafe once more. Ideas floated through the air like invisible pollen drifting between flowers. Questions sparked new conversations. New conversations sparked new possibilities. She realized something quietly. "This cafe is like the soil in the garden." Mangolius nodded. "How so?" Sproutlyn gestured toward the room. questions grow here. Mangolius smiled warmly. Exactly. Sproutlyn finished her tea and stood. Well then, Mangolius raised an eyebrow. Yes? Sproutlyn grinned. I have another question. Mangolius chuckled. Of course you do. Sproutlyn pointed toward the horizon beyond the harbour. What happens when someone finally sails far enough? Mangolius followed her gaze. The Ocean of Parc stretched endlessly beyond the harbour entrance. Eventually, he said calmly, they discover something important. Sproutlyn tilted her head. What? Mangolius smiled gently. That journeys have seasons. Sproutlyn blinked. Like gardens? Mangolius nodded. Exactly like gardens. Next comes a beautiful and reflective chapter. Chapter 16. The Garden of Many Seasons, where Sproutlyn learns that growth follows cycles, and every stage of life has its own purpose. Chapter 16. The Garden of Many Seasons. The afternoon light stretched long and soft across the dock of listening as Sproutlyn and Mangolius stepped back onto the deck of Egabrag. The harbour had settled again into its thoughtful rhythm. Conversations at the Black Orchid Café had softened into quieter tones, like the gentle afterglow that follows a lively gathering. The sails of Egabrag moved slowly in the returning breeze, breathing in and out like great white lungs catching the wind. Sproutlyn wandered toward the garden beds. She knelt beside the soil and studied the plants carefully. Something had been puzzling her. She looked at the basil, then the rosemary, then the small sprouting shoots of mint just beginning to stretch upward from the soil. Mangolius, she said thoughtfully. Yes, he replied, leaning comfortably on his staff. Why are these plants all doing different things? Mangolius smiled slightly. They are in different seasons. Sproutlyn blinked. But it's the same day. Mangolius chuckled. Yes, but growth does not follow the calendar. Sproutlyn looked again at the garden beds. One plant was flowering, another was just beginning to grow, another had been recently pruned, another was producing seeds. It's like they're all at different stages of life, she said slowly. Mangolius nodded. Exactly. He walked to the edge of the garden bed and gently brushed his hand across the leaves. Every garden passes through seasons. Sproutlyn listened carefully. Spring, Mangolius continued, is the season of beginnings. Sproutlyn looked at the small new shoots pushing through the soil. They look excited. Mangolius chuckled. New growth often is. He pointed to the taller herbs stretching confidently toward the sun. Summer is the season of expansion. Sproutlyn nodded. They look busy. Mangolius smiled. Yes, energy flows strongly during summer. He then gestured toward a small cluster of plants where seeds had begun to form. Autumn is the season of harvest. Sproutlyn leaned closer. So plants share what they've grown. Mangolius nodded. Yes, and winter? Sproutlyn asked. Mangolius pointed toward a shaded section of soil where nothing appeared to be happening. Winter is the season of rest. Sproutlyn blinked. But nothing is growing there. Mangolius smiled gently. Look deeper. Sproutlyn crouched lower. She brushed the soil aside carefully. Tiny roots were quietly spreading beneath the surface. Her eyes widened. Oh! Mangolius nodded. Winter prepares the next spring. Sproutlyn sat back on her heels. That's clever. Mangolius chuckled. Nature rarely wastes effort. The breeze shifted gently across the deck. The sails rustled softly. Sproutlyn leaned against the railing and looked out across the Ocean of Parc. So life has seasons too. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn tilted her head. Some people are just starting. Mangolius nodded. Spring. Sproutlyn pointed toward the harbour where new sailors were learning to tie ropes. They're figuring things out. Mangolius smiled. Yes, spring is curious, Sproutlyn continued. Some people are building things. Mangolius nodded. Summer. Sproutlyn pointed toward the amphitheatre. Like the speakers earlier. Mangolius smiled. They were sharing the fruits of their journeys. Sproutlyn thought for a moment. And some people teach. Mangolius nodded. Autumn. Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. They pass on what they've learned. Mangolius leaned on his staff. Yes! Sproutlyn looked again toward the quiet garden bed where roots grew invisibly beneath the soil. And winter? Mangolius smiled gently. Winter is reflection. Sproutlyn nodded slowly. So rest is not failure. Mangolius shook his head. No, it is preparation. Sproutlyn leaned against the railing again. I think people sometimes panic when they're in winter. Mangolius chuckled softly. They do. Sproutlyn nodded. They think they've stopped growing. Mangolius gestured toward the hidden roots. But growth often happens where it cannot be seen. Sproutlyn smiled. That's reassuring. The sun lowered slightly now, casting golden light across the harbour waters. Small boats drifted quietly along the calm sea. The lighthouse in the distance glowed softly in the late afternoon light. Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. So journeys have seasons? Mangolius nodded. Yes, Sproutlyn gestured toward the ocean. And sailing probably does too. Mangolius smiled. Indeed. Sproutlyn counted on her fingers. Sometimes you prepare. Mangolius nodded. Spring. Sometimes you move quickly. Summer. Sometimes you share what you've learned. Autumn. And sometimes you rest. Winter. Mangolius chuckled. You have understood perfectly. Sproutlyn leaned back against the mast. I like this system. Mangolius smiled. It is very old. Sproutlyn looked out across the horizon. The vast waters of Parc shimmered softly beneath the lowering sun. Everything seemed peaceful, balanced, steady, but something still puzzled her. She turned toward Mangolius. If life follows seasons... Mangolius nodded. Yes, then something must move those seasons. Mangolius smiled knowingly. Yes. Sproutlyn tilted her head. What is it? Mangolius gestured toward the ocean. Currents. Sproutlyn looked out at the water again. The surface appeared calm, but she remembered what he had taught earlier. Beneath the surface, the ocean was always moving. She squinted thoughtfully. So the real forces are invisible. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn smiled slowly. I think we're about to learn something deeper. Mangolius rested his staff lightly against the deck. Indeed. Next comes a powerful chapter. Chapter 17, The Current Beneath the Surface, where Sproutlyn discovers that the most powerful forces shaping our lives are often the ones we cannot see. Chapter 17, The Current Beneath the Surface. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon, and the waters of the Ocean of Parc shimmered like polished glass brushed with gold. From the deck of Egabrag, the harbour seemed peaceful. Too peaceful. The sails rested in the soft wind. The garden leaves swayed gently, catching the last warmth of the day. From the terrace of the Black Orchid Café, faint music drifted across the water, carried by the evening breeze like a quiet thought travelling between friends. Everything appeared calm, and yet Mangolius Draconium leaned quietly against the railing, watching the ocean with the careful attention of someone who knew better. Sproutlyn joined him, folding her arms thoughtfully. I've been thinking. Mangolius smiled slightly. That is becoming a habit. Sproutlyn nodded. Yes. She looked out at the water. You said seasons move because of currents. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn squinted. But I can't see any currents. Mangolius raised an eyebrow. Can you see the wind? Sproutlyn paused. Well, no. Mangolius nodded. Yet you see what it does. Sproutlyn looked at the sails above them. They filled gently with air, pulling the ship forward with quiet determination. Right! Mangolius gestured toward the ocean. The same is true beneath the surface. Sproutlyn leaned over the railing and stared down into the water. At first she saw nothing unusual, just the gentle reflection of the sky. Then she noticed something. Small strands of drifting seagrass moved slowly through the water, not randomly. They followed a clear direction. Wait, she said. Mangolius nodded. Yes, Sproutlyn pointed. That grass is moving sideways. Mangolius smiled. Follow it. Sproutlyn traced its path with her eyes. The grass drifted slowly across the harbour, then curved gently toward the open sea. That's a current, she said. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn looked amazed. But the surface looks calm. Mangolius leaned on his staff. Surface calm does not mean stillness. Sproutlyn watched the drifting grass carefully. So the ocean is moving even when it looks quiet. Mangolius nodded. Always. Sproutlyn straightened and looked toward the horizon. The water stretched endlessly outward, glowing beneath the evening sun. How many currents are there? She asked. Mangolius smiled. More than any map can fully capture. Sproutlyn blinked. That sounds complicated. Mangolius chuckled. The ocean enjoys complexity. Sproutlyn crossed her arms thoughtfully. So ships are always moving through invisible rivers. Mangolius nodded. Yes, rivers within the ocean. Sproutlyn looked impressed. That's beautiful. Mangolius smiled. And powerful. Sproutlyn leaned against the railing again. What happens if a navigator ignores the currents? Mangolius gestured toward the horizon. The ship will drift. Sproutlyn nodded slowly. So understanding currents is essential. Mangolius nodded. Yes, Sproutlyn thought for a moment. Then she said something quietly. I think life has currents too. Mangolius smiled. Indeed it does. Sproutlyn began counting slowly on her fingers. Emotions, Mangolius nodded. Yes, beliefs. Yes, habits, smiled. Very good, Sproutlyn continued. Relationships, Mangolius nodded. All currents. Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. So people are always moving through invisible forces. Mangolius leaned comfortably against the mast. Exactly. Sproutlyn watched the drifting seagrass again. It moved slowly but steadily through the water. So the secret is learning to read the currents. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn tilted her head. And sometimes using them. Mangolius smiled. The greatest navigators do. The breeze shifted gently. The sails of Egabrag caught the wind again. The ship moved slightly farther out into the harbour. Sproutlyn felt the motion beneath her feet. Is Egabrag in a current right now? Mangolius nodded. Yes, Sproutlyn grinned. That's exciting. Mangolius chuckled. Currents can carry a ship great distances with very little effort. Sproutlyn leaned forward eagerly. So instead of fighting the ocean, Mangolius finished her thought, you learn to travel with it. Sproutlyn smiled widely. That sounds like good advice for life. Mangolius nodded. It often is. The evening sky deepened into shades of amber and violet. The lighthouse in the distance began preparing its lantern. One by one, the harbour lights flickered to life. Sproutlyn watched the horizon thoughtfully. Currents move slowly. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn looked back at the drifting seagrass. But they shape everything, Mangolius smiled. Exactly. Sproutlyn leaned against the railing and watched the ocean breathe. I think the hardest part is noticing them. Mangolius nodded. Awareness is the navigator's greatest skill. Sproutlyn smiled quietly. I'm starting to notice more things. Mangolius chuckled. That is how journeys deepen. Sproutlyn looked toward the harbour. The warm glow of the Black Orchid Cafe reflected across the water. Travellers moved slowly along the dock, continuing their evening conversations. Ideas drifted through the air like invisible pollen. She turned back toward the ocean. If currents shape the journey, Mangolius nodded. Yes, then something must steer the ship through them. Mangolius smiled knowingly. Indeed. Sproutlyn squinted thoughtfully. The rudder? Mangolius shook his head gently. Something even more powerful. Sproutlyn blinked. What? Mangolius tapped the deck lightly with his staff. The crew. Sproutlyn frowned slightly. But Egabrag doesn't have a big crew. Mangolius smiled. Every ship has a crew. Sproutlyn crossed her arms. This sounds suspiciously metaphorical. Mangolius chuckled. It is. Next comes a very insightful chapter. Chapter 18. The Crew of Habits, where Sproutlyn learns that the small daily patterns of life quietly steer the entire journey. Chapter 18. The Crew of Habits. Evening settled gently across the Ocean of Parc, and the harbour began its familiar transformation into a lantern-lit constellation of quiet activity. Lights flickered on along the dock of listening, reflecting across the water like scattered stars that had decided to visit the sea for the night. From the open doors of the Black Orchid Cafe, laughter drifted softly across the dock. The warm glow inside promised tea, conversation, and ideas that might wander into unexpected places. On the deck of Egabrag, the garden lanterns had been lit as well. They hung among the herbs like small patient moons, casting a golden light across the soil beds. Sproutlyn sat cross-legged beside the basil planter, thinking very hard about something. Mangolius Draconium leaned against the mast, quietly polishing the brass compass with a small cloth. After several minutes of silence, Sproutlyn spoke. You said the crew steers the ship, Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn looked around the deck. I only see 2 of us. Mangolius chuckled. The crew I speak of is not always visible. Sproutlyn frowned thoughtfully. That sounds suspicious. Mangolius smiled. It is also accurate. Sproutlyn leaned back against the planter box. Well then, she crossed her arms. Explain. Mangolius set the compass back on the navigation table and walked slowly across the deck. Tell me something, he said. What did you do this morning when you woke up? Sproutlyn blinked. I stretched. Mangolius nodded. Then I checked the garden. Yes, Sproutlyn thought for a moment. Then I asked questions, Mangolius chuckled. That is certainly one of your habits, Sproutlyn smiled proudly. I enjoy questions, Mangolius nodded. Yes, he gestured around the deck. Every action repeated regularly becomes part of the crew. Sproutlyn tilted her head. So habits are crew members? Mangolius nodded. Yes! Sproutlyn looked intrigued. That's a strange idea. Mangolius smiled. Let us examine it. He pointed toward the rudder. When the navigator adjusts the rudder, Sproutlyn nodded, the ship changes direction. Mangolius nodded. Yes. He then pointed toward the compass. When the navigator checks the compass, Sproutlyn continued the thought, they stay oriented. Mangolius smiled. Exactly. Sproutlyn leaned forward. So habits guide daily movement. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn began counting on her fingers. Checking the garden. Mangolius nodded. A good habit. Asking questions. Also useful. Listening carefully. Mangolius smiled. Very useful. Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. So habits quietly steer everything. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn looked out across the harbour. The lights of the Black Orchid Cafe shimmered across the water like small golden paths stretching toward the ship. People probably don't notice their habits very often, Mangolius chuckled softly. Most do not. Sproutlyn leaned back against the railing. But they're always working. Mangolius nodded. Always. Sproutlyn thought for a moment. Like crew members moving around the ship. Mangolius smiled. Exactly. Sproutlyn grinned. That makes sense. Mangolius gestured toward the ocean. A ship with a skilled crew sails smoothly. Sproutlyn nodded. Yes. And a ship with a careless crew? Sproutlyn winced. Probably crashes into things. Mangolius chuckled. Occasionally. Sproutlyn leaned forward thoughtfully. So if someone builds good habits, Mangolius nodded, their journey becomes easier. Sproutlyn smiled slowly. And if their habits are poor, Mangolius finished her thought. The ship may drift into trouble. Sproutlyn nodded. That explains a lot. The wind moved gently through the sails above them. Egabrag rocked softly against the tide. Sproutlyn looked toward the garden beds again. You water the plants every morning. Mangolius nodded. Yes, Sproutlyn pointed. You check the compass every day. Yes, you adjust the sails carefully. Mangolius smiled. Indeed. Sproutlyn leaned back with satisfaction. So the ship is guided by many small actions. Mangolius nodded. Small actions repeated become powerful patterns. Sproutlyn looked pleased. That's a good crew. Mangolius chuckled. It is. Sproutlyn looked out across the water again. Beyond the harbour, the vast ocean shimmered beneath the rising moon. She felt something settle quietly inside her thoughts. So navigation isn't just about big decisions. Mangolius nodded. No. It's about small daily choices. Mangolius smiled warmly. Sproutlyn stretched her arms. That's much less intimidating. Mangolius chuckled. Yes. Sproutlyn leaned on the railing and watched the moonlight ripple across the sea. The ocean looked endless, mysterious, full of journeys waiting to be discovered. She sighed happily. I think I'm becoming a navigator. Mangolius nodded approvingly. You are. Sproutlyn tilted her head thoughtfully. But something still puzzles me. Mangolius raised an eyebrow. What is that? Sproutlyn gestured toward the horizon. If someone builds good habits, Mangolius nodded. Yes. And reads the currents? Yes. And listens for guidance? Yes. Sproutlyn crossed her arms. Then, eventually, they reach their destination. Mangolius smiled. Usually. Sproutlyn looked curious. And then what? Mangolius looked out across the vast ocean. The moonlight shimmered across the water like a silver path stretching endlessly into the night. He said quietly, they discover something surprising. Sproutlyn blinked. What? Mangolius smiled gently. That the destination was never the true purpose of the journey. Sproutlyn tilted her head. That sounds mysterious. Mangolius chuckled softly. It is. Next comes a profound chapter. Chapter 19, The Island That Was Not the Destination, where Sproutlyn discovers that the true purpose of the journey is transformation, not arrival. Hub Chapter 19, The Island That Was Not the Destination. The moon had travelled high across the sky during the night, and by morning the Ocean of Parc shimmered beneath a new day. Light spilled slowly across the water like honey poured from the horizon. Sproutlyn stood at the bow of Egabrag, her leafy hair stirred by the gentle wind. The sails had caught the breeze again, and the ship moved steadily across the harbour entrance toward the open sea. For the first time since stepping aboard, Egabrag was not merely drifting or resting. It was sailing. Sproutlyn grinned. We're moving. Mangolius Draconium stood at the helm, his hands resting lightly on the wheel. Yes. Sproutlyn stretched happily. "This feels like progress." Mangolius chuckled. "Movement often does." The harbour slowly receded behind them. The dock of listening grew smaller. The lanterns of the Black Orchid Cafe faded into tiny golden points. Even the amphitheatre of echoing wisdom became a gentle curve of stone along the shoreline. Ahead, the open ocean stretched wide and inviting. Sproutlyn leaned forward eagerly. "I can see something." Mangolius glanced toward the horizon. "Yes." Far ahead, rising from the ocean like a quiet thought emerging from the mind of the sea, stood a small island. Green trees crowned its rocky edges. White sand curved along its shore. Sunlight glittered across shallow turquoise water surrounding it. Sproutlyn clapped her hands. "An island!" Mangolius nodded. "Yes!" Sproutlyn smiled broadly. "So that's the destination?" Mangolius raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" Sproutlyn blinked. "Well, it looks like one," Mangolius chuckled. "Let us see." Egabrag sailed calmly toward the island. The breeze remained steady. The sails billowed gently. The ship cut through the water with graceful ease. Sproutlyn watched the island grow larger. Palm-like trees swayed in the wind. Bright birds circled overhead. The shoreline gleamed like polished pearl. "It's beautiful," she said. Mangolius nodded. "Yes." Sproutlyn looked pleased. "So we sailed here successfully." Mangolius smiled. "Yes." Sproutlyn crossed her arms triumphantly. "That means we arrived." Mangolius looked thoughtfully at the island. "Perhaps." The ship drifted slowly along the island's edge. The water here was clear enough to reveal schools of fish darting through coral beneath the surface. Sproutlyn leaned over the railing, delighted. "This place is wonderful." Mangolius nodded. "It is." Sproutlyn looked around. "So what do we do now?" Mangolius shrugged slightly. "We could stop." Sproutlyn blinked. "Could?" Mangolius smiled. "Or we could continue." Sproutlyn frowned thoughtfully. "But why would we continue?" Mangolius pointed toward the horizon beyond the island. Sproutlyn followed his gesture. Far beyond the island, the ocean stretched endlessly again. The horizon curved gently, hiding new possibilities just out of sight. Sproutlyn tilted her head. "Oh." Mangolius leaned against the railing. "Many sailors believe the island is the goal." Sproutlyn nodded. "That seems reasonable," Mangolius chuckled. "Until they arrive." Sproutlyn looked confused. "Why?" Mangolius gestured toward the island. "Islands are places of rest." Sproutlyn nodded. "Yes, they offer shelter. Yes, they provide fresh water. Yes." Sproutlyn smiled. "That all sounds excellent." Mangolius nodded. "It is." He then looked toward the horizon again. "But the ocean continues." Sproutlyn blinked. "So the journey continues." Mangolius nodded. "Yes." Sproutlyn leaned against the railing thoughtfully. "So destinations are temporary." Mangolius smiled warmly. "Exactly." Sproutlyn watched the island carefully. Birds moved through the trees. The waves lapped softly against the sand. It looked peaceful, but she noticed something. The wind still blew, the current still moved, the horizon still called. She nodded slowly. "I understand." Mangolius waited. "The island is not the end." Mangolius smiled. "No." Sproutlyn looked thoughtful. "It's part of the journey." Mangolius nodded. "Yes." Sproutlyn turned back toward the open ocean. "So journeys don't end with arrival." Mangolius chuckled. "They transform." Sproutlyn smiled. "That's comforting." Mangolius leaned on his staff. "Because the greatest change during a journey," Sproutlyn waited, "is not distance travelled." Sproutlyn tilted her head. "What is it?" Mangolius looked at her kindly. "The traveller." Sproutlyn blinked. "Oh." She thought quietly for a moment, then she laughed softly. "I suppose I'm not the same Sprout who first stepped onto Egabrag." Mangolius chuckled. "No." Sproutlyn looked back toward the harbour. It was now barely visible in the distance. "I've learned about currents," Mangolius nodded. "Yes." "Seasons." "Yes." "Storms." "Yes." "Habits." Mangolius smiled. "And," Sproutlyn looked out at the horizon, "how to listen." Mangolius nodded warmly. "Yes." The wind shifted gently again, the sails adjusted. Egabrag turned slightly away from the island. Sproutlyn watched the ship begin to move once more toward the open sea. "Where are we going now?" she asked. Mangolius smiled. "Forward." Sproutlyn grinned. "That seems appropriate." The island slowly drifted behind them. Not abandoned, not forgotten, simply past. Another moment in the unfolding map of the journey. Sproutlyn leaned on the railing and watched the horizon. "I think I finally understand something." Mangolius raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" Sproutlyn smiled. "The ocean is not trying to bring us somewhere." Mangolius waited. "It's teaching us how to sail." Mangolius chuckled softly. That is a beautiful realization. Sproutlyn stood quietly for a moment, feeling the wind in the sails and the motion of the ship beneath her feet. Then she turned toward Mangolius. So what is the final lesson? Mangolius smiled gently. The one you have been learning all along. Sproutlyn tilted her head. What? Mangolius gestured toward the garden growing across the deck of Egabrag. The garden, Sproutlyn blinked. Oh, next comes the final 2 chapters of the journey. Chapter 20. The garden that steers the ship, where Sproutlyn realizes that the inner cultivation of life is what ultimately determines the direction of the journey. Chapter 20. The garden that steers the ship. The island faded slowly behind Egabrag as the ship continued across the open waters of the Ocean of Parc. The breeze remained steady now, filling the sails with a calm confidence that carried the vessel forward with quiet purpose. Sproutlyn stood near the center of the deck, surrounded by the garden beds she had grown so familiar with. The basil leaves shimmered in the sunlight. The rosemary branches stretched confidently toward the sky. Tiny mint sprouts had spread farther across the soil than they had just days before. Sproutlyn crouched beside them thoughtfully. Something about this garden still puzzles me, she said. Mangolius Draconium stood near the helm, watching the horizon with his usual calm patience. What puzzles you? He asked. Sproutlyn brushed the soil gently with her fingers. All the lessons we've learned. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Storms. Yes. Currents. Yes. Habits. Mangolius smiled. Yes. Sproutlyn looked up at him. But we keep coming back to the garden, Mangolius chuckled softly. Indeed we do. Sproutlyn leaned back on her heels. I think it's the most important part. Mangolius rested his hands on the railing. Why do you think that? Sproutlyn looked around the deck. The garden was alive, not decorative, not symbolic, alive. Roots stretched quietly beneath the soil. Leaves caught the sunlight. Bees drifted lazily from flower to flower. I think the garden is teaching the ship, she said slowly. Mangolius smiled. Yes, Sproutlyn continued. The roots know where to grow, Mangolius nodded. Yes! The leaves catch energy. Yes, Sproutlyn pointed toward the soil. The plants grow stronger every day. Mangolius chuckled. They do. Sproutlyn stood and looked toward the sails. And everything we learned about sailing, Mangolius waited, is exactly the same. Mangolius's eyes sparkled. Sproutlyn walked slowly across the deck. The compass is like roots, Mangolius nodded. Orientation. Sproutlyn pointed to the sails. The sails are like leaves, Mangolius smiled. Receiving energy. Sproutlyn gestured toward the rudder. The rudder is like pruning, Mangolius chuckled. Small corrections. Sproutlyn pointed toward the map table. The map is like a garden plan, Mangolius nodded. Guidance. Sproutlyn leaned against the railing. And ballast is like soil, Mangolius smiled. Stability. Sproutlyn looked amazed. The ship is a garden, Mangolius chuckled softly. Yes, and life is both. Sproutlyn turned slowly in a circle, looking at everything with new understanding. The sails, the garden, the ocean, the horizon, all of it worked together. The systems mirrored each other. The lessons repeated themselves across different forms. This whole voyage, she said quietly, was teaching the same lesson from many directions. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn looked at the garden beds again. So the real navigation system, Mangolius waited, is inside the garden. Mangolius smiled warmly. Exactly. Sproutlyn knelt beside the soil once more. She placed her hand gently against the earth. The warmth of the sun had softened the soil, and she could feel the subtle life within it. Tiny movements, roots growing, water traveling slowly through the earth. I think the garden is teaching patience, she said softly. Mangolius nodded. Yes. Sproutlyn smiled. And care. Yes, and balance. Mangolius leaned on his staff. Very good. Sproutlyn looked out across the ocean. The waters of Parc rolled endlessly beneath the sky, vast and full of possibility. The ship sails across the ocean, she said slowly. Mangolius nodded. Yes, but the garden decides how we travel. Mangolius chuckled softly. That is the deepest secret of the voyage. Sproutlyn stood and brushed the soil from her hands. So if someone tends their inner garden, Mangolius finished the thought gently, their journey becomes aligned. Sproutlyn smiled. That means life navigation isn't about controlling the ocean. Mangolius nodded. No, it's about cultivating the garden. Mangolius smiled warmly. Yes. The wind moved gently through the sails. Egabrag glided smoothly across the water. Sproutlyn watched the horizon quietly for a moment. Then she looked back at Mangolius. "I think I'm ready." Mangolius raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Sproutlyn grinned. "To explain this to someone else." Mangolius chuckled. "That is how wisdom continues." Sproutlyn looked toward the distant shoreline. The harbour was far behind them now, but she could still imagine the warm lantern glow of the Black Orchid Cafe and the stone seats of the Amphitheatre of Echoing Wisdom. She smiled. "I know exactly where to begin." Mangolius nodded approvingly. "Good." Sproutlyn crossed her arms proudly. "I will start with a story." Mangolius laughed softly. "Of course you will." The wind lifted again, the sails filled, Egabrag sailed onward across the wide waters of Parc, and upon its deck the garden continued to grow, quietly, patiently, steering the journey in ways both subtle and profound. One final chapter remains. Chapter 21. The Navigator of Gardens, where Sproutlyn becomes a teacher at the amphitheatre, sharing the wisdom of the voyage and beginning the next generation of explorers. Chapter 21, The Navigator of Gardens. Time, like the tides of the Ocean of Parc, does not rush forward. It moves with rhythm, sometimes in waves of activity, sometimes in long, quiet breaths. And so it was that many days later, the ship Egabrag found itself once again drifting gently toward the familiar shoreline of the Dock of Listening. The harbour appeared exactly as it always had. Lanterns swayed softly along the wooden docks. The warm windows of the Black Orchid Cafe glowed like amber stars against the evening sky. From the stone terraces of the Amphitheatre of Echoing Wisdom, the quiet murmur of gathering voices drifted across the water. But something had changed. Not the harbour, not the ocean, not even the ship. The change had occurred somewhere much quieter, inside Sproutlyn. She stood now at the bow of Egabrag, watching the harbour grow slowly larger as the ship approached. The sails moved easily in the evening wind. The garden behind her had flourished. The basil had grown tall. The rosemary branches had thickened. The mint had spread joyfully across its bed like a green carpet of quiet enthusiasm. Sproutlyn smiled. "Home again?" she said softly. Mangolius Draconium stood beside the mast, his staff resting lightly against the deck. "Yes." Sproutlyn looked back at the garden. "I didn't realize how much it would grow." Mangolius chuckled. "Gardens rarely remain still." Sproutlyn nodded thoughtfully. "Neither do people." The ship drifted smoothly alongside the dock. Ropes were secured, the sails relaxed. Egabrag settled into the harbour like a traveller returning to a familiar chair. Sproutlyn stepped down the gangplank. The wooden boards of the Dock of Listening felt comforting beneath her feet. The smell of tea and roasted herbs from the Black Orchid Cafe drifted through the air, welcoming her like an old friend. Travellers passed by, their conversations carrying the gentle energy of curious minds exploring new questions. Everything felt familiar, and yet different. Sproutlyn turned toward the amphitheatre. Lanterns had been lit along the curved stone steps. A small crowd had gathered. Someone stood at the center of the stage, finishing a story. The listeners leaned forward eagerly. Their attention moved like a tide toward the storyteller's words. Sproutlyn watched quietly. Mangolius stood beside her. "Well," he asked. Sproutlyn smiled. "I think I know what comes next." Mangolius raised an eyebrow. "Oh," Sproutlyn nodded. "Yes." She walked slowly toward the amphitheatre steps. The stone felt cool beneath her feet. The air carried the scent of sea salt and lantern oil. As she entered the amphitheatre, the storyteller on stage finished their tale to warm applause. The audience shifted slightly, waiting for the next voice. Sproutlyn paused at the edge of the stage. For a moment she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect for the quiet space where so many ideas had already been shared. Then she stepped forward. Mangolius watched from the upper steps, smiling quietly. Sproutlyn stood at the center of the stage. The amphitheatre curved around her like a giant listening ear. Lantern light glowed softly against the stone walls. Faces looked toward her with curiosity, some young, some old. Some travellers, some gardeners, some sailors, all listeners. Sproutlyn took a breath. "I would like to tell you a story," she said. The amphitheatre grew still. Her voice echoed gently across the curved stone seats. "It is the story of a ship called Egabrag." Several listeners leaned forward. Sproutlyn smiled. "It sailed across the Ocean of Parc." She paused, "and upon its deck grew a garden." The listeners exchanged curious glances. Sproutlyn continued. The garden taught the navigator how to sail. Soft laughter rippled through the amphitheatre. Sproutlyn began to walk slowly across the stage as she spoke. It taught about routes and compasses, about sails and leaves, about storms and patience, about reefs that distract and lighthouses that guide. The listeners grew quieter as the story unfolded. Sproutlyn's voice carried the rhythm of the ocean itself. She spoke of currents beneath the surface, of habits that steer the ship, of islands that are not destinations, of seasons that shape every journey. And finally, she spoke of the garden. The most important lesson, she said gently, was that the garden steers the ship. The amphitheatre fell completely silent. Sproutlyn looked around at the listening faces. If you care for the garden of your life, your journey will find its course. The lanterns flickered softly. The ocean breeze drifted through the amphitheatre. And somewhere in the distance the lighthouse sent its steady beam across the darkening sea. Sproutlyn smiled. The ocean is vast, but the tools are simple. She raised one small finger. Listen. Another. Observe. Another. Cultivate. She paused. And sail. For a moment the amphitheatre remained quiet. Then applause rose slowly from the stone seats, not loud, but warm, thoughtful, like waves rolling gently onto a familiar shore. Sproutlyn stepped back from the center of the stage. Mangolius approached quietly from the upper steps. "Well done," he said softly. Sproutlyn smiled. "I think the story will grow." Mangolius nodded. "Stories often do." Sproutlyn looked toward the harbour. The sails of Egabrag moved softly in the night breeze. The lanterns of the Black Orchid Café glowed warmly along the dock. And the vast Ocean of Parc stretched endlessly beyond the horizon, full of currents, winds, and journeys yet to begin. Sproutlyn folded her arms thoughtfully. "I think someone else will sail next." Mangolius smiled. "Yes." Sproutlyn looked back at the listening travellers. "Perhaps one of them." Mangolius nodded. "Perhaps. Perhaps." The lanterns flickered. The ocean breathed. Beneath the soil of the world, quiet roots continued to grow, always searching, always listening, always guiding the next voyage. Final conclusion. The lesson of Egabrag. The voyage of Egabrag teaches a simple truth hidden within a complex world. Life is not navigated by force. It is navigated by attunement. Just as a sailor reads wind and current, and just as a gardener studies soil and season, a wise traveller learns to observe the patterns of existence. Storms will come, winds will fade, currents will shift, but the one who tends their inner garden will always find their course again. For the true navigator is not merely a sailor of oceans, they are a navigator of gardens, and the journey continues. Synopsis. After sailing across the vast Ocean of Parc, learning from storms, stillness, currents, and conversation, Sproutlyn comes to understand the quiet truth that Mangolius had been guiding her toward all along. Navigation, she realizes, is not truly about conquering the ocean. The ocean will always shift. Winds will change, storms will appear, currents will move beneath the surface, and destinations will come and go. No sailor can control these forces. The true skill of the navigator is not domination, but attunement. Through the voyage of Egabrag, each lesson revealed a deeper pattern. The ship and the garden were reflections of the same system. Roots mirror compass bearings. Leaves receive energy like sails catching wind. Soil provides stability just as ballast steadies the vessel. Pruning is like adjusting the rudder, small corrections that gently redirect the journey. Sproutlyn finally sees that the most powerful navigation tool is not found on the map table or the mast. It is found within the garden one cultivates inside their life. The thoughts we nurture, the habits we repeat, the questions we ask, and the patience we practice become the unseen crew steering our path. When that inner garden is tended with care, awareness, and curiosity, the journey naturally aligns, and so the voyage never truly ends. The ship continues to sail. The ocean continues to change, and new travelers arrive, curious about how to find their way. Now Sproutlyn stands where she once sat, at the amphitheatre of echoing wisdom, sharing the story of the garden that steers the ship, inviting others to listen, observe, cultivate, and sail their own course across the mysterious waters of life.